but scholars uniformly agree that the only history that lasts is evidence-based history. Hence, we have to ensure that we not only secure our present and future, but also our past. No doubt the past cannot be undone, but we can definitely learn lessons from it. These lessons not only guide us in our present endeavors, but also can form underlying principles for all our future projects and plans in the offing. Towards this end, the Tamil Heritage Trust have themed our current Indology festival as Harappan Civilization, a Century of Discovery. Over the course of 6 days, we are celebrating the centenary of the announcement of the discovery of an ancient Indian civilization along the banks of Indus. Over the last 3 days, we had 6 extremely rich and well-researched lectures which helped us to gain in-depth knowledge about various aspects of this civilization. A very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us on day 4 of this festival. Today also, we have 2 important talks lined up for you. As all of you are aware, although Harappan civilization was discovered almost 100 years ago, many aspects of this civilization are still shrouded in mystery and an enigma to us. In fact, there is no uniform theory regarding the origin of this civilization, its various cultural variations and vagaries, and how this civilization declined, if at all, or transformed. Adding to the confusion is the fact that the Indus Valley civilization script is as yet undeciphered. In fact, there is no clarity as to how many languages were there in the civilization or how many scripts. 2 other important aspects of the civilization, not much dwelt upon, include 1. The food dietary components and variations of the civilization. Or putting it simply, what all did these people eat or not eat over this vast geographical area over a period of 2000 years? The second important question is families. What sort of families did these people have? Joint? Nuclear? Did they have families at all? Was there a concept of marriage? Monogamy? Polygamy? Polyandry? What sort of society? Matriarchal? Patriarchal? How many children did they have in average? So on and so forth. Fortunately for us, we have 2 very important speakers who will be covering these very topics today. First, we have Dr. Jennifer Bates, who will be talking about food and agriculture of the Harappan times. She'll be followed by Dr. Brad Chase, who will be talking about family and kinship in Harappan times. Before we move on to the main program, I'd like to give you a very brief introduction about Tamil Heritage Trust, our organization. Tamil Heritage Trust is a voluntary organization started almost 14 years ago by a group of like-minded people. The main intent was to understand, appreciate, disseminate, and celebrate various aspects of Indian heritage and history, not just for the scholarly and the erudite, but the average public who may have a passionate interest in it. Towards this end, we conduct several activities throughout the year. First among them are talks and seminars. Every month on the first and third Saturdays, we have talks. The first Saturday talk is an online talk and is in English. The third Saturday talk is an in-person talk and usually in Tamil. Then in the month of December, we have what is called Pechu Kacheri or an oratory concert, which is conducted across 2 days. Basically, many of you may be aware of the fact that Chennai has its musical concert season in December. So this event is meant to collaborate and coincide with that. Then we have the Indology festival and we are already on the 4th day of that. We also conduct various types of workshops for the normal people who can register and join. The first set of workshops are 1-day workshops, which are called How to See a Museum, How to See a Temple, etc. These are split into 2 sessions. In the forenoon sessions, we have a series of lectures where we discuss various aspects. In the afternoon session, the participants are taken practically to the site and we discuss what was whatever was taught earlier, the same things are pointed out to them. Then we have classroom sessions over a period of time on and off, where we teach Grantham script, ancient Indian mathematics, ancient astronomy, etc. Then another program we have is called Alamar Avai, that is aimed at the school teachers of Tamil Nadu. Over a series of weekend lectures, aspects of history and heritage are discussed. The idea being that these teachers will take them back to their students, thus helping to spread awareness. Another event that is undertaken every year by us, usually in the month of January, is a site seminar. This is basically an in-house event, the intent being to enhance our own knowledge and awareness. Usually we zero in on a particular site within India, and over 3 to 4 months, our volunteers spend their time to understand different aspects of this site, and we have a large number of in-house seminars after that. Armed with all this knowledge, we visit these sites and experience them and come back and try and document it. THT has also instituted 2 important awards to commemorate individual contributions to the field of Indian heritage, history and epigraphy. The first award is called Professor Swaminathan Heritage Award and named after our co-founder, Professor Swaminathan. The second award is called V. Venkaiah Epigraphy Award and is jointly hosted by the great-granddaughter of P. Venkaiah, who was the first official epigraphist of India, and THT. We are into the 5th year of the first award and the 3rd year of the second award. We have a dedicated YouTube channel where you can find links to all our past talks right up to yesterday's talks. You can subscribe and click the bell icon to receive notifications of our future events. We have a website and these are our social media handles. And to join our mailing list, you can mail us at this address and you'll receive mails from us. Last but not the least, we are a voluntary organization. We don't have any dedicated financial backing, so any kind of contributions are welcome. You may use this barcode and address to give your contributions. Now moving on to the main program. As I already told you, we have 2 important talks lined up today. Our first speaker for the day is Dr. Jennifer Bates, and she'll be talking about what's on the menu, food and agriculture in Harappan times. The Indus civilization that covered an area that includes modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan and northern India, along with the state of Shortagai, was one of the most ecologically complex of the Old World Bronze Age civilizations. To quote John Marshall, great cities with teeming populations like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa could never have come into being save in a country which was capable of producing food on a big scale. Building on the diversity of ecozones, rivers, and rainfall systems, this civilization incorporated and developed the earliest examples of large-scale agricultural systems in the South Asian subcontinent. Traditionally, the Indus has been viewed as powered by winter wheat and barley, with millet as a secondary crop on the periphery. However, in her talk, Dr. Bates will present an updated view of the agricultural systems prevalent then. Incorporating the massive amount of data created from the many projects and specialists that have been working in the Indus over the last 100 years, the picture that emerges is one of a culture at the crossroads between West and East Asia, where different floral influences were mixed, mingled, and experimented with by expert farmers working within the mosaic of Indus environmental settings. Dr. Bates will closely examine farmers and their decisions in considering the important question, how did the Indus feed itself? Dr. Jennifer Bates' research mainly focuses on the prehistory of South Asia with interest in how people engage with their environments, food resources, and economic, social, and climatic surroundings. In her research, she works with plant remains, both macrobotanical, that is charred seeds primarily, and microbotanical, mainly phytolith remains. Currently an assistant professor of archaeology at the Seoul National University, Professor Bates gained her PhD at the University of Cambridge and went on to do postdocs at Cambridge, Bow, and UPenn. She has published numerous works on the subject of Indus civilization foodways, agriculture and climatic change, southern Indian Neolithic to Iron Age cooking, and Mesolithic Ganges rice domestication. She has also worked in many other regions of the world and time periods. Her big project at the moment is the Indica project, co-directed with Professor Vikas Kumar Singh of Banaras Hindu University, looking at the origins of rice agriculture in the Ganges. She is also working on the Korean working group of the larger land cover 6K project, a global effort to understand land use change in the Holocene. She has a book coming out in autumn 2024 with Cambridge University Press, The Origins of Agriculture in the Bronze Age Indus Civilization, which synthesizes the available data on genetics, archaeobotany, and archaeology for the use of plants by Indus people. Over to you, Dr. Bates. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to share the screen. Okay, so let me just do that quickly. Bear with me. And let me know if you can see that. Okay, so thank you for the generous introduction. What I'm going to be talking about today, as was introduced, is the general overview of where we have reached in understanding the food and how people got their food in the Indus civilization. And I'm going to confess at the beginning of this talk that I'm an archaeobotanist, so we're going to be focusing on the plant side of this story and not so much on the animals. And I do apologize for that, but it's my personal love and I'm the one giving this talk. Unfortunately, the slides do not seem to be moving. Hang on 2 seconds. Apologies, technical difficulties here. Let's just quickly go back to there and see if I can get it to move. There we go. Okay, so technical difficulties over. Where the story really begins for us is that archaeobotany in the Indus civilization has typically, and still is typically, seen as the poor handmaiden of other regions of the world. When we look at books and papers that are synthesizing global archaeobotany, so global plant use, it tends not to get included because people see it as not having enough material or we don't understand the picture. And what I want to try and do with this talk is show you that this is just not the case. And in fact, far from being the poor handmaiden of other regions, particularly the Near East, in fact, the Indus has a vast wealth of material, data, and understanding that we can build from and show what was going on at the time. And I want to head up this talk by saying that what I'm going to show you is not necessarily my work. It is the work of a large number of people over the 100 years or more of research into the Indus, but particularly work that's been happening in the last 20, 30 years. And I've put a few examples of these papers on the slide, just for you to see them, to show you that there is a diversity of people working on this. We are really in a time period where there is great interest in the foodways of Indus people. And I really hope that this continues and that we see more of this coming out. The way that I've structured this talk is to give you a very brief introduction to the Indus as an ecological melting pot that encourages diversity in farming and in food, and then to give you an outline of the history of archaeobotany before we get into some of the details around what people were using and some of the questions and challenges we still have to address. So with that being said, let's look at the background. The Indus is a region with great ecological diversity. As was mentioned in the introduction to this talk, it's covering a huge area. Some estimates put it at 1 million square kilometers. If we compare that to other Bronze Age civilizations, it's much, much bigger. And that means that it's going to incorporate a lot more diversity. So we've got different river systems, we've got two different rainfall systems, both the summer monsoonal system and the winter westerlies. And we've also got all of these other variables coming through, such as different mountain zones, we've got deserts, we've got salt pans, and we've got complex coastlines. This is not a homogeneous flat environment. And that's really critical, especially for a plant person, when you're thinking about what can be grown, how can it be grown? It creates possibilities. On top of that, we've also got climatic variation. That's both in terms of the landscape, but also the time period that we're dealing with. So this is just a nice Köppen Geiger climate map that I borrowed from Cameron Petrie, who's going to talk more about the idea of how did the Indus cope with climate change in another talk, I think it's tomorrow. And it just shows you that there is a great diversity in the climate where the sites are. And this also changes over time. We get into the 4.2K event, which I believe he's going to talk about, and I'll mention as well later on. But that just heads it up a little bit. And one thing I like to do when I'm giving this kind of talk is say that it's all well and good for me to give you maps and data, but it can help to just see what this is like on the ground. And we all know that South Asia is extremely diverse, but seeing it like this can help. So we've got our deserts, we've got our salt pans, we've got different rivers, the coastlines, we've got extremely lush grasslands, but they're different in different places. And the rivers are extremely different in how they flow. So we've obviously got the Indus, we've also got all the different rivers of the Punjab that come through. Then we've got reaching as far across as the Yamuna, which has its own dynamics. And we have a seasonal river in the summer, the Gagahakra River. So it's incredibly versatile and flexible in this landscape. And depending on where you are, it's going to affect what you do, what you can do, and how far you can push different strategies. And we all know about, I'm not going to give a big background on the Indus, I don't think I need to, but we know that the Indus has been renowned for being dull, homogeneous and boring because of quotes from Marshall and Wheeler. But we also know that this is not really true. The Indus is vibrant, it has a lot of diversity within it. Yes, there are shared themes across the Indus, like the black and red pottery, like the use of stamp seals and a shared weight system. But there are variations on that theme. And this is a really nice example of this. This is a form of black and red pottery, but it's got a really distinct and unique design on it. This is from Dablyvas Chugta, a small site across in Rajasthan. And again, thanks to Cameron Petrie and the Landwater Settlement Project for letting me use this slide. One thing we also know is that the Indus has typically been studied by looking at its cities. Now, obviously, this has been changing in the last 30 years, where people have started to think more about the other kinds of settlements that might be around it. And in particular, this has affected our understanding of plant use or farming systems, agricultural systems, because one of the big questions that's always been affecting our understanding of agriculture is, how do you feed a city? This is that big question that Marshall kind of posed to us way back when he said that big cultures and civilizations like this could only come into being if they had a serious food system to support these big cities. But we need to understand that system. We can't just say it exists. And so a lot of research these days is now turning towards understanding these cities in the context of other sites. So doing research on things like the villages, the towns, specialist sites that might be production centres, looking down into other regions and expanding outwards away from these cities, bearing in mind that they still exist, but thinking about them in the context of the network of the Indus. And that kind of brings me to the point where we have to really think a little bit about the history of archaeobotany in the Indus, because it has been affected by some of these issues around focusing in very much on the cities and trying to think a lot about them. Before we get to that, though, I want to just head up what I mean by archaeobotany, because not everybody in the audience is going to be a specialist on this. So when I talk about archaeobotany and plants in archaeology, some of you might already be thinking, well, how can she be analysing stuff that's several thousand years old? Because when I'm in my own kitchen, it only takes a matter of a few days, particularly in the hot, humid summer that we're experiencing right now, for the plant matter in my kitchen to go from this yummy food to looking like this. So how are we able to look at plant matter over thousands of years if it's rotting at that kind of speed? And this is where archaeobotany has to start thinking about preservation methods. And in the Indus, unfortunately, we are not in a particularly special set of conditions that allows plant matter to survive. We don't have these three particular, and I've got them as symbols, special conditions that we like as an archaeobotanist to have. That would be freezing, or extremely dry conditions, or extremely wet to the point where you can block out oxygen. Because there are 3 or 4 big vectors of destruction of plant matter. That would be the inclusion of water, because that's allowing oxygen and other parasites to get in. Oxygen, everything needs oxygen to survive. And then all the bugs and the bacteria that are going to be feeding off the plant remains and using the water and the oxygen as well. If you freeze things, you can block all of this out. If you dry it, you take away the water. And if you swamp it out, you can get rid of the oxygen. But we don't have those conditions in the Indus, and we're left with situations where it's basically just normal soil. So how are the plant matters surviving? There is a way of preserving plant matter for archaeologists that is very useful. And this is something that we all do in our own kitchens on a regular basis that we might not want to do, but it does happen. And that's burning things. So we burn things on a regular basis in our kitchens, in our homes. And when you burn something, you replace the organic matter, the bit that would be eaten by the bacteria, the fungi that rots away, with inorganic carbon. And there's nothing that can eat carbon. There's no chemical really that breaks it down particularly. And so it survives over very long periods of time. And this is what we're getting in the Indus region. And in fact, it's what we find in pretty much every region of the world. This is the main matter that archaeobotanists will look at in terms of their materials. So we find beautiful preservation, if you are lucky, in terms of your charred remains. And these are remains from across the world, just to show you that it's not necessarily a special thing. Charred material turns up all over the planet. And this is what I look at in the Indus and in other parts of the world. So here you can see some charred cereal grains, some charred nuts, and some charred fruit seeds. These are grape pips. When archaeobotanists are talking about these kinds of materials, we like to divide ourselves into different kinds of archaeobotanists. So we have 2 different divisions of material, macro and micro. And that just means things I can see with my own eyes, macro, big, and micro, things I cannot see that are there unless I have a microscope to even know about it. So a macro thing would be something like a seed. It could be something like a piece of straw. It could be a lump of charcoal. In this case, you have some seeds at the top. So you've got a millet grain. You've got a piece of matting that's been preserved, an impression of a seed in a food lump. And then on the bottom row, there is a piece of charcoal, another seed that's even tinier, a very tiny one, and then a root that's been charred. So these are macro botanical. And we like to divide ourselves up even further into further specialisms. So I don't look at charcoal. It's not my specialty. I know what it is. I can vaguely tell you what it might be, but it's not my thing. So we divide ourselves up further, but generally macro. And this is just to show you what some charcoal things look up very close. It all looks like wood to me. There are some very good charcoal specialists out there. If you want to look at South Asian charcoal, people like Carla Langelotti and Eleni Asuti are very good specialists in this material. I'm not going to talk about charcoal today because it's not my thing. Micro are things that we just can't see are there unless you've got a microscope. So that might be something like pollen. That's probably the one you're most familiar with, pollen. If you've got a lot of it, you can see it as a big cluster on the back of your hand. But to find an individual grain of pollen, you would need a microscope. There are other microfossils out there, things like starch. Again, if you take a potato and you rub it on the back of your hand and let it dry, you'll get a starch residue on there. But to get an individual starch grain, you will need to look down a microscope. I've also put phytoliths here. That's the one that looks very spiky. Phytoliths are silica casts of plant cells. They form during the plant's life, and they're basically made of glass. So they survive very well when the plant dies, and we can analyze them. I can't analyze pollen. It's not my specialty. I don't analyze starch. There are people that do starch analysis in South Asia, people like Marco Medella and Carolina Jimenez Ortega. I don't, but I can do phytolith analysis. So I might mention phytoliths a couple of times. So this is the kind of material that we can look at, that we can understand, and that gives you an idea of the kinds of things that people have started to look at and to understand. In terms of how we got to this point where we're analysing different materials in the Indus and the history of Indus archaeobotany, we can actually go all the way back to the very beginning, to the 1920s, those first excavations. Now, they weren't looking at things like those microfossils, the fancy starch, pollen, phytoliths. In fact, they weren't really known about in global archaeology until much later in time. What we have in the 1920s instead is more of an understanding of the presence of charred seeds. And in these first excavations, we have people hand collecting individual seeds and looking at them and working out what species are present. And in the initial excavation reports for Harappa, Chanhudaro and Mohenjo-daro, we have the presence of wheat, barley, peas, dates, and a type of melon. In the end, they end up describing it as Cucurbitaceae, the melon family, being present. These have all been hand collected, so individually picked out by eye. The very first slide that I put up, my title slide, was a big dish of wheat and barley grains from Mohenjo-daro. That is a lot of seeds to have hand collected. So it's an impressive piece of work to have done. What we do know is that we've changed in our methodology over time. And in a paper in 2002, Dorian Fuller suggested that we have three phases that Indus archaeobotany and South Asian archaeobotany has developed in. The first one was called the consulting paleobotanist phase. And this went from the very beginnings right up to the 1970s. And this was when archaeologists, if they found something, would call in a botanist, maybe a person doing paleobotany, so archaeological botanical material, and ask them, what did I find? It wasn't that there was a directed question. It wasn't driven by the botanical questions. This was a case of just asking about what things had been found post the excavation. This changes in the 1970s when we start to see more of a professionalization. The archaeobotanist becomes an actual position. And this is because of the development of new technologies like flotation, which is a method by which you add soil to water. The soil is heavy. The seeds are light because they're now carbonized. They float and you can collect them much easier than hand picking everything. And so we start to get large quantities of material coming out, and the archaeobotanist becomes an essential person on site to do this, to manage the material. And now we start to get questions driven by the archaeobotany rather than it just being a secondary product of an excavation. So we start to see a professionalization in that it becomes a regular part of digs. From the 1980s or the late 1980s onwards, things start to get a little bit more complex because theory from archaeobotany starts to look backwards and say, we need to critique our ideas, we need to understand, are we doing this right? What are the models we're building? And that's a really interesting phase to be in. Now, myself and Professor Marco Medella have argued recently that we're in a period of self-critical reflexivity. By that, we basically mean that we're kind of discussing the nature of our data creation, not just looking at the theory we're using, but asking very basic questions around how comparable are our data sets? Is the material that you got from your site the same as the material I got from my site? And if not, is that because there is a difference between big city, small village, or Punjab versus Gujarat? Or is it because you collected it using this method and I collected it using this method? Did we create the difference? And that's a really important question to start having. The reason we can be in this phase is we've now got a big data set. And so we can have these big questions. And that's why I'm arguing we're not the poor handmaiden of other regions anymore. We're in a position where we can do this, where we can be reflexive. Some regions of the world can't. And it's an exciting place to be because it means we in the Indus are at the forefront of theory and methodology. And that's kind of cool. One of the reasons I say this is we have 63 sampled sites. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot. In fact, it only represents 10% of the known Indus sites. Not great, but that's 10% of the known sites. In other words, 10% of all the sites that people have ever visited. If you take it as 10% of the excavated sites, that's not true. It's 50% of excavated sites. I can't think really of another region of the world where 50% of all excavated sites have archaeobotanical material. That's really good. And because of that, we can start looking at some of these issues around sampling. That's where it starts to get a little bit less good because only 30 of them, so 25% of the excavated sites, used flotation, this incredibly important method for separating material systematically. And only 19 report their data as quantified, so numbers that we can run statistics on, actually look at patterning. 10 of them, 10 extra sites give rough quantification. So they say around 3, more than 10. And 6 sites don't actually give us identifications. They just say that they had some seeds. So there are some things we can improve on, but the fact that we can do this is cool. It's really, really exciting. And this is something that we need to start expanding to other parts of South Asia and start really sort of using it as a, well, using it as a model and saying we need to improve on this, but let's start getting the ball rolling and doing flotation regularly at every excavation, quantification at every excavation. It's not difficult to do. You need a bucket, you need some soil and some water. I'll explain the method at the end, but this is just to show you it's not difficult. And the stuff you get back can be really tiny. So you can, far from being that big sort of hand-picked stuff, this is 200 microns, scale bar. A hair is 50 microns. This is a tiny little fragment, and it allows us to think about, this is from a particular weed species, so it allows us to think about the ecology. Imagine if you get hundreds of these, which we do using flotation. You can think about entire systems of agriculture. You'd miss these if you didn't do this, but we are, so we can have these conversations. And we're starting to use these other methods and doing multi-proxy analysis. So not just doing macros, but building in these other materials. This is some really beautiful phytolith material, and it shows you like a nice comparison. This is husk of wheat, and underneath it is the husk of a millet grain. So we're starting to see things that might be invisible macrobotanically can be picked up by the phytoliths. Okay, that's enough of me waxing lyrical about the benefits of our data set. What have we actually done with this? So there's been some model building. This is just one example of the models, but going further back than this, model building began right at the very start when people started to excavate. As I said, Marshall came up with this idea that the big cities were full of these teeming populations supported by big grain production. People like Wheeler took it further and suggested that things like this were granaries. And they both suggested that this was to hold all that wheat and barley that they were finding by hand collecting. Models have moved on. This is, however, the traditional model that has come up, and it's the one that's been really cemented in people's minds. This is the traditional model that you'll find in a lot of textbooks, and it's one that is built around data coming out of Harappa primarily, because that's where the biggest data set was until recently. So in this model, it suggests that in the early Harappan, so pre-urban, we have barley, which is a winter crop, a rabi crop, that everything is grown on a household extensive system. In order to support that big growing city, during the mature Harappan, they shift to wheat. It's got a slightly higher yield. That's a rabi crop. Everything centralizes to support the city, and it's intensive growth. Then the 4.2K event happens. Something happens, 4.2, maybe something culturally, and more millet gets included. Millet to this point in this model has been peripheral. It's been something you do in Gujarat. But in this model, it starts getting used in core regions, such as at Harappa. And so you get a mixture of summer and winter crops, so rabi and kharif crops. And everything decentralizes, becomes household. And then in the post-urban period, we see rice, this summer cropping, everything's household, and we don't really know how they're growing it, whether it's intensive or extensive. This is the traditional model, and it does work at some sites. So on the data we have available at the moment, it works for Harappa. I believe that might be changing soon because new Harappa data is coming out. But currently it works for Harappa. But I want to show you that it's much more complicated when you start looking across the whole of the Indus. That complex, big, ecologically diverse, culturally diverse Indus. And even Weber himself, who built that model, reminded us in one of his papers, it's going to get complex. Look at all the different variables that are going to go into this. So, with all of that, what crops do we actually have? This is just to remind you of all those different sites all over the place that are giving us data. It's all over the region. It's not just in one ecozone. And what we have, there we go, is a huge range of different things. It's not just the wheat and barley, it's a lot of stuff. The work that all the archaeobotanists have been doing in this region have finally shown us, up to this point, that we have 339 different taxa. So by taxa, I mean different units of things. So those would be things, everything from family level identifications, so things that might be the grass family, all the way down to species level identifications of things like Triticum aestivum, bread wheat. It is a big data set. Within that, we've got things that are everything from grasses through to beans and pulses, through to fruits and oil seeds, and into all the different kinds of weeds that are cultivation weeds that we can use to think about the ecology. This is a lot of data to play with. If we start to break it down a little bit, we can look at the things that we know from analysis are repeated appearance plants. which suggests that they are being used for food. So we have winter crops, our rabi crops. We have crops that fall somewhere in between. And I suggested a while ago in a paper that these might be zaid, so that weird sort of hot summer season before the monsoon hits. And then we've got the Kharif monsoonal crops. So we've got wheat, we've got barley, we've got peas, lentils, chickpeas, we've got flax, so linseed, and we've got jujube. But we've also got things that are growing in the Kharif season. We've got rice, we've got lots of millets. Most of that is millets. We've also got a huge number of tropical pulses, so the mung and the urd. And we've got lots of oil seeds, so mustard and sesame, for example, and some really interesting fibers, so cotton, for example, hemp, jute, and some really fun fruits. So we've got date, we've got walnut, we've got almond, and some fodder crops, things like clover that you might feed to cattle. This is a really good range of things to start thinking about. What I'm going to do, though, is walk through the three big crops, the three big ones that people discuss, and then look at how technology is adding to this, new technology, and how new theory is allowing us to think beyond just this is what I have into what can I do with this as an archaeologist. So the first thing that most books are going to talk to you about is wheat and barley. So this is the one we're going to start with, is wheat and barley. And that's because, as I mentioned a little while ago, wheat is found very early on in the excavations at places like Mohenjo-daro, Chandhuadaro, and Harappa, along with sesame, peas, some barley, and some sesame. And this is just clipped out of the excavations at Harappa, the report that was handed over by the botanist that they got to look at it. And this sort of creates this idea that the Indus is built on the staple winter crops. And as I mentioned, those models have now got to be changed a little bit, but it still makes these winter crops very interesting for us because we have to ask the question, where did they come from? Because they're not native to the Indus region. They are, in fact, native to the Near East. They're native to the Fertile Crescent. That's where they're first domesticated, according to current evidence. The first place that we start to see wheat and barley turning up is at Mehrgarh, one of our famous sites, Mehrgarh. And I'm not going to go into the debates around how old is Mehrgarh, what is the date on this, but we know that it's at least mid to late 7th millennium BC. So let's say 6,500 to 6,000 BC to be on the safe side. What we have are the impressions of wheat, barley into mud brick and also into the floor surfaces. And there's also a few grains in some of in the 1B period. When this is all added up, it works out that 90% of the assemblage, 90%, is made up of naked 6-row barley. It's a particular type of barley, Hordeum vulgare, subspecies vulgare for the botanists in the crowd. There's also some other forms there. There's a hulled version of this. There's also a wild version of 2-row barley, which is very exciting. And then there's some wheat as well. There's domesticated einkorn wheat, domesticated emmer wheat, and also domesticated 3-threshing wheat, Triticum durum. But it's basically barley and wheat, mostly this 6-row naked barley. The presence of both wild and domestic barley, though, has led to one of the biggest debates at Mehrgarh in period 1. And that is, was there a local domestication? The whole story has always been, these are Near Eastern crops. They get moved across through some manner into Mehrgarh, and then from Mehrgarh and that region, they disseminate into the Indus. Now, we know that cattle domestication is seen at Mehrgarh. We've got both genetic evidence and also the actual morphometrics, the measurements of bones that was carried out by Meadow on the cattle at Mehrgarh that shows domestication at the site of cattle over the time period of the Neolithic. So the question is, was that happening with barley? Because we have wild and domesticated barley. Well, some of the genetics is beginning to suggest that there were two regions for barley domestication, one in the west and one in the east. But this is where it all sort of falls down as an idea. Most of the other genetics suggest that that eastern branch was a secondary domestication, something that happened later. And all the archaeobotany that we have shows that there is a Near Eastern domestication happening. And when we look at these wild grains that are coming out of Mehrgarh, which is pretty much the only site that we have them this early, they're all showing a distinct lack of change over time, which is what you need to show a domestication story. And it seems more likely that what's happening is that there is a group or trade in barley from one region to another, and these wild things are coming along as a weed of the crops. So that creates some really interesting questions that need to be resolved as to how are things moving from the Near East to Mehrgarh, bringing along wild barley as a co-weed with its domesticated cousin. When it does get down onto the Indus, what we start to see is that it's quickly picked up, and it does become, wheat and barley do become staple crops at sites like Harappa. So, for example, we see at Harappa that they use a very controlled monocropping strategy, so really focused in on that Rabi season and really focused in on the cereals. There's very little other strategy going on, and even in the later period when millets are added in, it's not a huge amount. Wheat and barley really are doing what Marshall said, which is powering Harappa according to current data. But there's been a lot of question about what happens during the late Harappan period. Is this wheat and barley story the reason that the cities fall down? Because during the late Harappan period, or the lead up to the late Harappan period, we see a climate change event called the 4.2K event. It's a period of sudden dryness. We get aridity, there's the change in the summer monsoon, and there's been a suggestion that this leads to a change in the agricultural strategy by farmers, shifting away from wheat and barley that need a lot of water towards crops that do not need a lot of water, like millet, but that are lower yielding, and that this would therefore lead to a strategy that cannot provide enough security for the cities to be maintained, to maintain those populations. And so people start leaving the cities as a risk aversion strategy and going back out to the periphery, to the villages, rather than staying in the cities. I believe Cameron's going to talk in more detail about this tomorrow. And this certainly does seem to be the case in some sites. So this is some really cool work that Anil Pakaria has been working on down in Gujarat at sites like Kisara and Kanma, where we see a very sharp change from a barley-based strategy just before the climate event to one that is millet-based after the climate change event. This is a really sharp, sudden change. If you look at the pie chart at the bottom in C, you've got blue for the barley in that period just before the climate change event, and then loads of orange in the soteria, that's a millet, after the climate change event. That's a sudden snap change. Now, if we were to use this as our new basis for the model, because it's a stronger signature than we have at Harappa, for example, it would support the idea that the wheat and barley was abandoned by the Indus towards millet. But not every site is doing this. The Indus is not that simple. The Indus is gloriously complex. And even within Gujarat, we see that there are sites that just don't seem to do this. This is Rojdi, a site studied by Professor Steve Webber, and it shows that there are no major use of wheat and barley in any time period. Even from the earliest to the latest parts of Rojdi, they are focused just on millet. And it's just about playing around with different kinds of millet. rather than having a sharp and sudden shift around. So that wheat and barley story is never going to be simple, and there's never going to be a simple model that says the Indus is based on wheat and barley until the late Harappan, where it shifts to millet. And just a final note on wheat and barley before I move on to millets, because I think millets are really interesting. Wheat isn't actually that easy, neither's barley for that matter, but we often think about wheat as just being this really easy crop to talk about. When wheat chars, when we burn it, it changes shape, it distorts, it gets twisted, it can puff in different ways. And that can make identifying it quite difficult. Not making it so we identify it as the wrong thing, but certainly changing our identification of the specific type of wheat that we're looking at. In fact, some archaeobotanists, myself included, will be so cautious that many times we will just say it's wheat. We won't even try and determine whether it's a particular type of wheat. This gets really difficult when you're dealing with the three threshing wheats, which is what we mostly have based on a different part of the wheat plant, the spikelet bases, the attachment points, where you can actually see this and the distortion doesn't happen. Three threshing wheats puff in weird ways. And trying to tell the difference between a bread wheat and a durum wheat, this is hexaploid and tetraploid wheats, is damn near impossible. And on top of this, there is a whole discussion rumbling underneath by the archaeobotanists about something called shocked wheat, Triticum sphericocum, and compact wheat, Triticum compactum. And those are sort of niggling little archaeobotanical and botanical discussions, but they have sort of important discussions for the future, for the Anthropocene that we're moving into, because they have different resistance to things like rust pest. For the archaeobotanists, in terms of an archaeological model, they're also really important. We need to know whether we're looking at sphericocum, compactum, estivum, durum, all these funny names, because they change the way in which you can use wheat. Some of these are gritty when you grind them. Some of them are more starchy, more glutinous. They have different flavors, different properties. And knowing which ones the Indus preferred and where they preferred them and in what quantities, in what associations with other crops, might change the way we understand the food they're using, not necessarily just their agricultural strategies, though we could think about, are they increasing something that's more rust resistant, this pest resistant, or more water loving or less water loving? But it also changes our understanding of their tastes in terms of their food. Do they like a gritty flour, or do they want something really smooth? Do they want something sticky or something really not sticky? It changes our understanding. So this is something that we still have to deal with as archaeobotanists, and it's going to take us a while. So this is our challenge. But millet is something that has been a challenge for even longer. Although we haven't really been discussing millet for as long as we have wheat, millet has become kind of the problem child of Indus archaeobotany. And I say that with love and affection because I think millets are one of the best crops to look at. Millets are fascinating because there's so many of them. Millet just means small seeded grass. It's not actually a botanical term, it's just a term, a shorthand that we use to describe anything that isn't big, basically. So it could be everything from foxtail millets all the way through to sorghum. It's a big range of things, and there's lots of different arguments about what you should put into the category of millet, what should not be put in there, and I'm not going to get into that. What we do know in the Indus is that these are things that grow in the summer months. So these are summer months, so kharif crops that are small seeded grasses. Incidentally, last year was the International Year of Millet because these are also arid adapted crops. They don't need a lot of water. They don't need a lot of care compared with wheat, barley, and rice. And so they are really good if you're heading into a period of climate change like we are with the Anthropocene. Love your millets, take care of them, eat them, and protect them whenever you can. I'm not going to go into the large millets because that's a whole conversation around issues of dating, identification, and the contact with Africa and there's problems around the genetics with those. We can talk about that in questions if you want. What I want to do is look at the small millets, because they've really been abandoned. We are lucky in the Indus that we have a huge range of small millets turning up. They turn up in abundance at our sites, despite the problem of the fact that they're very tiny, so they don't tend to get picked up unless you do flotation, and they can get damaged quite easily during charring. So unless you've been doing this really careful collection process, you won't have them. So they might not be in a lot of our early excavation material. With the recent excavations, we're finding, as I say, this sort of cool range of things. And this is a slide put together that includes material from Professor Beccaria, Dr. Juanjo Garcia Granero from one of the projects in Gujarat, and from myself when I was working on Professor Petrie's project. That's a lot of different things, and these are all different species here. It's really beautiful. Their identification is a pain, put it that way. And this is because we've had a tendency, whenever we find a small millet, and I say we, meaning archaeobotanists in South Asia, generically through time, to just assume that they were a Lucane coricana or a Lucane indica. This is a particular type of millet, finger millet, which is called finger millet because it kind of looks like a hand. It's also called ragi. And there's a reason for this, and that's because we find it in a lot of places, and also because it's just tradition. When you find a small millet, it's this millet. There's been a lot of research around where this comes from, where Lucane coricana comes from in terms of its genetics. Again, I'm not going to get into this, but there's been a lot of work recently led by Dorian Fuller, Professor Steve Webber, and then picked up by others, that has shown that quite a lot of our identifications have been misidentifications, and that what has been named a Lucane coricana could actually be any of these small millets, and that we have to go back through everything that's ever been excavated and recheck it, which is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And even then, this doesn't cover the full range of possible millets that are there. Because again, we are fortunate in the Indus, but also suffering as archaeobotanists, because it's a region where we have the potential for the domestication of these things. So there's all the wild ancestors that we have to take into account, and the changes over time. This is something that needs an entire PhD doing on it to sort of refine all of this. There's a lot of work done by Professor Fuller during his PhD, but it needs to be picked up again and added to. This is a massive amount of work. But one of the things that we do know, for example, is that unless you find really specific elements of the millet, it's going to be an absolute pain to identify. And this I put up here as one of these controversial examples that Professor Fuller has suggested was a misidentification of a Soteria as ragi millet. And the only reason he's arguing this is because of the seed coat. But it's based on photographs, and unless we can see the original, it's going to be a problem. And this was never resolved. So millets, they're difficult. And it occurs throughout millets again and again. This could be Panicum miliatum. It could be a whole other set of things. We have to really double check them. Despite all of this, what we do know is that we have these whole range of other things going on, that we have to go through all of them and start thinking about what they mean. Because when you do start to pull out and think about the possibility of all of these different species, what we start to see is a picture of the Indus using diverse groups of crops to manage potentially complex environmental conditions, but it could also be related to taste. Soteria pumila is very different from Soteria italica in terms of how you use it. Think back to that wheat story, grinding it up, it gives a very different flavor. It gives a very different texture in terms of its glutenaity, stickiness. And when we look at sites like places such as Shikarpur and Luteshwar, we have this very different sense of what it is to have millets at a site. This is sites in Gujarat. And we see how they are using their millets to handle particularly arid environments, but also building them in alongside strategies that are using wheat and barley, but also using other small weedy crops like chenopodium and trianthema, and other things like starches from beans that might be creating whole sets of complex flavors. So this is a really nice piece of work that was done by Dr. Garcia Granero, to really think through how different groups are managing their landscapes and taking advantage of different kinds of watering conditions, because different millets need different amounts of water, and also taking advantage of traded in crops like the wheat and barley to create an entire, what he called a workman's palette. We can also look at this in places like Rojdi and Babakot and see the complexity of the agricultural strategy. I'm not going to go through this in any detail because I want to instead show that you can get all of these different strategies happening within two sites, very close, relatively speaking, to one another. This is Dabli Chugta, where we have barley and we have millets being used. But we can see that somewhere like Masudpur, they're using millets, they're using rice, they're using bread wheat, and they're using tropical pulses. And the millet is a different kind of millet from the one that they were using at Dabli. So really getting into the fine nitty-gritty of all of these details really pulls out different stories around the diversity of the strategies. And speaking of the rice that we had at Masudpur, it is worth just me saying the Indus had rice. And I have to keep echoing this because this is an argument that keeps being had over and over again, that the Indus didn't have rice. So we know that there's a sort of controversial topic, that where was rice domesticated? I'm running a whole project in the Ganges to try and solve this problem. Well, help with this problem. And I'm very lucky to be supported by my co-director, Professor Vikas Kumar Singh of BHU, and Professor Ravindranath Singh as well. And the funding and students from both universities. And I'm not going to get into what was happening in the Ganges at all, other than to say it's an amazing place to go and work and to look into the discussions that are being had there. What we do know is that there is really interesting use of rice in the post-Indus period, where they're starting to use it as a chaff. These are chaff impressions of rice in painted greyware period pottery that was dug up fresh from Bahola, a site in the Indus region. So really exciting things. But there's been a whole argument being made that rice was not an Indus crop. So there's a really fun quote that comes out from Fuller and Medella, that says that even if they knew that rice was around, it was never a major crop for the Indus people. And I hope that this picture on its own shows, or at least questions that. We have a large amount of rice coming out from just the land water settlement sites, Masudpur 1, Masudpur 7, and so on. These are sites in the Indus. They date to the mature Harappan and even earlier. And this should not be a surprise because we've had rice coming out of various different sites over and over. There have been sites that have been reporting rice for a very long period, like Balu, like Kunal, like Banawali, like Hulas. They've all been reporting the presence of rice, and yet for some reason it's always been a controversial topic. And that's because of the dating of these rice grains. They'd never really been directly dated. And when we did have directly dated rice, the dates that came back were not Indus. So this was a very unfortunate moment. The rice that was discovered at Kanma did have dates that came back, and they came back to AD 335, despite being in mature and late Harappan phases. And there's all sorts of possible reasons for this. It could be percolation, as mentioned in the text. It could also be to do with contamination of the grains through other means, background material contaminating them. What's needed is direct date on Indus rice grains. And this is where a project that I was part of, Land Water Settlement, stepped in to say, okay, we have a lot of rice grains. In fact, we have so many rice grains, it becomes one of the major crops during one of our time periods in the Indus at one of our sites. let's fix this. Let's get dates. Let's securely date these grains themselves. And more than that, let's not just date the rice, but let's date other summer crops so that we can show that they are all coming out as Indus. And so what you can see here are the radiocarbon dates from Masudpur 1 and Masudpur 7 from different trenches with tropical pulses, wheat, different millets, and then the rice. And you'll notice that there are 2 contaminated samples, and that's fine. We understand those when we look at the stratigraphy. We can actually see the animal burrow that brings those in, and that confirmed our stratigraphy for us. But the rest of the dates fall beautifully into that mature Harappan phase, really, really quite beautifully. And there's a couple of dates that fall into the early part of the mature Harappan, or maybe the transitional part. So this is really beautiful data just to show that, yes, the Indus was using rice, and it was using a lot of rice. Rather more beautifully than that, though, we got these. So for those that haven't seen these before, these are spikelet bases. This is the attachment point where the rice grain attaches to the stem. So the little scale bar up there is showing you that these on average are about somewhere between 500 and 250 microns. That's 0.5 millimeter to 1/4 millimeter. These are tiny little things. And when a plant is domesticated, or a cereal plant is domesticated, one of the things that changes is how the plant reproduces. So in the wild, a cereal plant wants its seeds to fall easily to the ground when they're ripened. So it wants to have a shattering attachment point. When it's domesticated, the human who is using this plant does not want that to happen, because it means that they're going to have to go around and pick up every seed off the ground in order to use it, or harvest it whilst the grain is not yet ripe. So what we see during the domestication process is the shift from a shattering to a non-shattering attachment point. And usually along the way, what we have are immature proportions of the attachment points being immature, because they're harvesting them green in order to try and prevent everything from falling off. So we end up with a shift from lots of shattering wild types to an increase in the immature types to non-shattering types. And you're seeing all of those forms here: the wild, the shattering, the immature, and the non-shattering types. And what we did at the site was we found a lot of them. And we managed to show that in the northeast region of the Indus, so that'd be northwest India, we managed to show that there was a transition from wild to domesticated rice in the Indus. So the Indus has its own domestication of rice occurring. And one of the arguments that I've made in a recent paper, it came out last year, was that this might be because rice is being traded from the Ganges to the Indus. And when it's introduced to a new environmental setting, things usually change. And if it's being put into an anthropic environment, an agricultural setting, where it's constantly being stressed, it's under new conditions, it's never met them before, that process of domestication is going to be quick, far quicker than it would be under normal conditions. So it happens very, very fast over only 1,000 or so years, rather than the several thousand years of gradual change that we might expect during a hunter-gatherer to agriculturalist transition, the Mesolithic Neolithic transition. What we're seeing is basically a fast-paced domestication process, because rice has been flung into an agricultural setting designed for something like wheat or barley rather than a water-loving crop like rice. This is stressed plant. And that's really kind of fun. It's a really nice example of a probably dead-end domestication process. We don't necessarily see this leading to the Oryza sativa that we use today, the rice we use today, but it's still a really cool and exciting thing to see that the Indus people were adapting a crop to their own needs. So it's a really nice little piece of evidence of how versatile Indus farmers were, using something they'd never seen before in their own setting and modifying it, stressing it to get it to work. Now, the reason we were able to get these really nice photos is because we're using something called scanning electron microscopy, SEM. And although that's not a new technology anymore, it does nicely lead me into how new technologies are altering the way in which we understand the Indus. And I'm going to come back to residues in a moment, but I just needed a nice pretty slide to put in to show you that there's some really fascinating new technologies out there. One of the things that people have been discussing is how do pulses fit into this? And this is, again, another SEM image of a really nice horse ground bean, so macrotoloma bean, horse ground. And there's been a lot of discussions around whether or not there was domestication in the Indus of tropical pulses, so mung, horse ground. And it's really hard to actually understand the domestication of these things, because unlike the cereals, they don't really have a attachment point that can change. Instead, you're looking at the pod, where it goes from being fixed to one that opens to let the seeds out to one that doesn't do that. And pods don't survive archaeologically very often. So instead, you're looking at things that are even more difficult to see, like toxicity, which we can't really measure at the moment, at least not from charred seeds, to things like changing the way in which these beans are going to be staying in the ground before they sprout, so the thickness of the seed coat. And this is where some really exciting new work has been done. So there's been some traditional work looking at morphometrics, the measurement, the size, how this changes over time. And the Indus has been part of this. So you can see in here data from Kanma and Rojdi and a few other sites like Hulas as well, where they're looking to see if the seeds are wild or domesticated or sort of in a semi-wild domesticated space. This is work that was done by, Fuller and Murphy in 2018, and they were showing that statistically there is a slight change in these, especially in Gujarat. At places like Lateshwar, we're starting to see some of these increases in size over time. But taking it that step further, they wanted to see, can we actually get some really good evidence for humans manipulating these plants and leading to a domestication trait changing? So they use this really fun piece of kit. It's called a synchrotron, and it's essentially, how do I describe this? Synchrotron is basically this sort of giant, great big machine that will whiz round a high-powered beam and then bombard it through the seed and give you a high-resolution X-ray tomography. So it's not damaging the seed. You don't have to cut into the seed, but you can get these thin slices, very thin. We're talking like cellular level thin images all the way down the seed and see what's inside it. And you can see here in particular, image B and C shows you this, where we can see the cellular size within the seed without damaging the seed. And what they managed to show was that there was indeed a change in these seeds, but while the size of the seeds was changing during the Indus, seed coat thickness is a secondary domestication trait that takes place in the historic periods. So there's two stages for bean domestication. So it's a much more complex story than we had with the rice. And that's really kind of fun. And now we need to work out why and how this relates to the agricultural strategies. So that's a new challenge for us, is to look at these beans again, not just as beans that we have found, but in the context of the agricultural traditions of the Indus to try and figure this out. As well as that, we also have isotopes. Now, you probably heard about isotopes during high school, but to remind you, isotopes are atoms containing, they contain different numbers of neutrons, and we're trying to think here about, I'm not doing a very good description of this, but anyway, I will come back to you with a better description in some text that I will add to the slide later, because I've just looked at how much time I've got left. But anyway, what we're doing with isotopes is, for archaeological purposes, we're looking and interested in the stable ones in this particular case. There are unstable isotopes as well. Unstable ones are ones we use for things like dating. So radiocarbon is the one you're probably most familiar with. But for the stable ones, we can use them to start thinking about diet, about origin, about where something came from. There's a whole cycle for every isotope that it goes through, and they're absorbed by organic matter, either through their diet or through the water that they're drinking. And that's a really useful trait because we can start using it to think through the systems. In terms of the kind of questions we can ask, we can start looking at things like geographic origin and diet on different kinds of material. In terms of carbon, we're looking at things like whether we've got more of a C3 diet, so that would be wheat, barley, or rice, or a C4 diet, maize, sugarcane, millets, and we can distinguish and discriminate against those. If we're looking at nitrogen, we're looking at how much, how far up the trophic level you go. Are you eating a lot of vegetable matter? Are you eating a lot of meat that comes from herbivores, or are you a pure carnivore, or even eating carnivores? And we can also discriminate against marine input. This kind of material has been used by Brad Chase, who's actually speaking next, to look at things like pastoral lifeways. So this is where the animals come back in. He looked at the cattle, the buffalo, the sheep, and the goat at different sites to see where people were moving around the landscape and what these animals were eating, not necessarily the humans. And it's a really nice piece of work that suggests that there were some migratory patterns, but that most of these were not sort of huge distances, and that the cattle and the sheep and goats are having different patterns of life. And that's a really cool piece of work because this is then going to affect what the human isotopes look like as well. And isotopes have also been used recently to think about agricultural strategies when looking at the plants. So plants have stomata. These are these cells that open and close. And that changes their carbon dioxide levels. And also it's a part of the photosynthetic pathway. If a plant is under water stress, the stomata are going to close, and that's going to give a different readout than if the stomata are opening during a period of non-water stress. And what Dr. Penny Jones did was she took this idea and ran a series of experiments where she managed to show that you can find out if a plant was well watered, moderately well watered, or poorly watered, just by running the isotopes of the plant. And she then said, okay, if I can do this, I can apply it archaeologically in the Indus. And she took some seeds from Harappa, from Masudpur and Tirana that cover that 4.2K event, that period of shift from when it should be a normal climate to one of extremely dry climate, and asked, do we see an increase in the amount of water stress? And what does that suggest about the agricultural strategy? And what you're seeing here is the wheat and the barley. And what she found was that there was no water stress. And by using this kind of methodology, we're able to think about how farmers will maybe adapting to a time period when we know there is increased water stress from the 4.2K event, and start to ask questions like maybe they were moving the wheat and barley to fields where there is more access to the river water, or maybe they're diverting irrigation, or maybe they're reducing down the amount of wheat and barley, and we need to relook at our statistics. So this is a really nice piece of work that asks us to go and look at more questions. This I just put up because I wanted to lead from that into, this is the point at which archaeobotanists have to start theorizing. We've got a lot of data, we've got new technology and new techniques that are asking us to think about our material. And so archaeobotany has now turned, I would say in the last 10 years especially, towards a more theorized look at what this all meant to be an Indus farmer or an Indus person eating plants, animals, and daily life. This is a paper that myself and one of my undergraduate students, Choi Chung-woo, published in Antiquity late last year. in which we tried to rethink the idea of using what Weber was calling a tier 1 crop, so things like wheat and barley, versus tier 3 crops like foraged goods, and asking, well, how does that relate to strategies of sustainability in villages versus cities? One of the other things that's coming through is the idea of foodways. Foodways are really important theory in archaeobotany, generally speaking, and zooarchaeology. And they're trying to move us beyond just looking at piles of bones or seeds and ask, what does that mean in terms of the meal? Because when you look at something like this, you don't look at it and think, well, there's some potato, there's some boss, you don't look at it and you think through the different species. You look at it and think there's some spare ribs, there's some chips, and there's some coleslaw. You're not looking at it as a species list. You might be asking, why is somebody eating this? What are they trying to say about themselves? There's a great quote by Sherratt who says, "We do not eat species, we eat meals." And Levi-Strauss has gone on to say that food should not only be good to eat, but good to think. And this is where archaeobotany and zooarchaeology is moving. There's some great work being done again by Brad Chase and colleagues, where they've used the zooarchaeology at Golodoro to show that depending on where you are in the settlement, depends on which cuts of the meat you get. So it suggests that there's an inside and outside the wall set of people, and that affects what you're going to eat. And you might know if somebody's inside the wall and they offer you food simply by them giving you the wrong piece of meat. That's a really fun idea for the Indus. At Farmana, Kashyap and Weber started to look at the idea of the mixing of foods. So how do you create a meal, not just an ingredients list? And they did this by looking at starch on teeth and in pots and seeing what foods are repeatedly mixed together and which ones are not, and found that there are some really sort of interesting combinations. So, for example, I believe it was the wheat, the barley, and the millets were not mixed with things like spices and fruits. And that suggests that there's some really sort of specific ways of cooking. And this is being picked up by really current technology, which is residues. So residues are organic material like lipids, proteins, sugars that get sort of locked into the matrix of pottery. And I really recommend you the work of Aksheta Surinarayan and Kalyan Chakraborty, who've been looking at this. One of the things it allows us to do is to think about what was being cooked in a specific pot. So that was the really cool spiky graph that I showed earlier from Aksheta. This is what it looks like when you lay it out. And this is Kalyan Chakraborty's work, where he shows different vessels with different components in terms of C3, so wheat, barley, rice type plants, C4 being those millet kinds of plants, and then the fat content, so dairy, adipose, which is fat, and then non-ruminant adipose, so that's things like pig fat. And you can see how they're spread out and across. But there are different patterns in this. His work is in Gujarat, and you can see here there's some dairy going on. If you look at some of the material that Aksheta Surinarayan has been looking at, there isn't much dairy in some of the other areas of the Indus. So again, different foodways, different choices being made. And there are a lot of plants that I couldn't talk about today, and that's typical of Indus archaeobotany, because we get so wrapped up in the cereals and explaining that it's not just wheat and barley. We don't have time to mention all of these things, all the fruits, all the tasty bits, the dates that give us that sort of fibrous texture that's sweet, the crunchy nuts, the juicy grapes, the sour lemons that would change the palate of an Indus diet away from starchy carbohydrates to something that tasted like good food. And we need, as archaeobotanists and archaeologists, to ask the question, is there a regional variation within the Indus in terms of this bit likes sweet stuff, this bit does not like sweet things? What I want to do to end, because I am ending and I know we need to, is end with a quote that comes from Professor Steve Weber, who says that there are trends that we have identified based on only a few sites. They demonstrate the complexity of the agricultural strategies employed by the Harappans. And it's only through continued and careful work at these sites and others like them that this idea, this proposal, can be better understood and better explored. And I would say that if we do that, we can get to a picture like this, where we've got an exciting, vibrant Indus full of plants and full of food and the animals, giving us this idea of the smells, the tastes, etc. And I will end it there and say if there are questions about how to do flotation, for example, I have a slide to explain how to do that. And I will end it there for time's sake. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely mind-blowing. In fact, if not for the restriction in time, we would have loved to go on for another hour. But sadly, we have to, restrict the time because there is the next lecture. There are, in fact, quite a few questions, tens of questions, and unfortunately, I don't have the time for that also. I would like to share the questions with you. It's just amazing. What we would like to tell our viewers is that we will share the questions, and please, if whenever you find time and you can answer that, we will add it to the our website as well as this particular video page itself. But just we'll have time for about 4 or 5 questions maximum. So one of the questions from
But if she can close the screen share, both of you can come on video.
Yeah, that can be done.
Yeah.
Sorry, I will add you as well. MV Bhaskar wants to know if this data is open, accessible for other researchers to work with. Which I thought was...
That is a fantastic question. In 2019, I put together all of the published available archaeobotanical material that I could find into a database and published it with the Journal of Open Archaeological Data. So it is available to download. It's everything up to the point of publication. So there's a few things that are missing, but yes, it should be available. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm sure even a lot of amateurs who are following this would be really interested in getting their hands onto it and figuring out what to do. And one of the things that has happened over the last 4 or 5 days, that fourth day today, is that quite a few non-academicians have really taken a lot of interest in this. Let's see what comes out of it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, there's a very interesting question. You have given us a picture of what was found there. Can we even trace the route? You did talk about the west and the eastern foods have sort of converged there. But can we say this is where it first happened? You did show that in 1 or 2 of the slides. But can we authentically say these many different routes exist? Rice started in these places. Wheat started here and there. Barley started there. Mergar you showed. Can we actually come up with a complete picture?
Oof, that is a difficult question. It's one of those problems archaeology in general has, is that there's always going to be a time where somebody finds something earlier than yours.
Right.
What I would say is that we have some evidence for where we have early sites like Megar or, for example, Lahura that have early evidence for different things. What we need, rather than having the earliest place, is multiple examples of the same period, which will help us to have a much better understanding of the pattern. Because there's a saying in archaeological science that n equals 1 is n equals 0. So if you only have 1 point of data, you've got nothing. Which is why if you do radiocarbon dates, you have to have a lot of them to prove something. So rather than having one site, we actually need a lot of them. And so I would say in response to that question, at the moment, we're struggling a little bit, and it would be really good to have a lot more to support some of these arguments. When it comes to something like the wheat and the barley, I'm going to give it to the Near East and say, yes, they've got a lot of data to show the origins of wheat and barley in the Near East. But when it comes to some of these other crops, like Eleusine coricana, one of these controversial millets, we're relying a lot on the genetics, to be honest, and genetics is really difficult to use. So we
Right.
need a lot more data.
Okay.
Patri, I had a very basic question. See, you said the main crops are barley and wheat, which are winter crops, no? What were they cultivating during the summer?
So
Right.
in the winter, in the winter we've got barley and wheat along with peas and chickpeas and lentils. In the summer monsoonal period, we've got rice and
Right.
different millets. So
But
those
were they
millets
cultivating them simultaneously? Because you said there were many areas which had only wheat and barley, no? So in those areas, what were they doing in the summers? Yeah.
Well, this is the question, and we're not entirely sure. So there's possibilities that the land could be left fallow, so to leave it to recover. Because if you're doing intensive cropping of one thing like wheat, especially if you're doing it every single year, you might need to leave it in the summer just to let it renew. Whereas if you're doing a much more complex strategy of growing summer and winter crops, you can maybe have one field being, let's say, wheat in the winter and then a bean crop in the summer, and that will renew the land. But if you're just doing wheat every year, it's going to need at least one season to fix itself. So we need to actually do exactly what you're suggesting, which is go into much more detail about the strategy, not just the crops. And there are ways we can do this. And I would suggest the best way to do this is weed ecology. So the things that we tend not to look at as archaeobotanists are all these small little things, all the pest crops. So things like the chenopodium, all these weedy things that grow at the side of fields that nobody likes. They tell us so much information because they have very specific growth habits. They like particular soil. They like particular amounts of nitrogen. They don't like being fussed with. And if you know what they like, what people have done to the soil. So understanding them is so important.
I'm forced to pick only two more questions now. One, quite a few have asked is, what is a food mix? Though you said you will only talk about the vegetation side of things, almost everyone wants to know what was the amount of veg versus meat, were they eating both, and if so, in what proportion, which is more, which is less. Can you even come up with some kind of a guess, conjecture?
Okay, so so this is a couple of points on this. First point is the archaeobotanists, the zoo archaeologists, and the residue people need to work better together. Traditionally, we haven't worked very well together. We've all worked on our own. It has come to the point where we have to work together. And we're all kind of willing to do that, but we don't know how. What I would say is that at every single site, you find archaeobotanical data, so seeds, plants. You find zoo archaeology, so animal bones. And now that we have residues, we find residues. So we know that there is plant and animal material at both sites. The residues are suggesting that we have definitely got meat being cooked. The problem the residue people have is that plant residues don't survive very well. So they're always going to be biased towards the animals. But we know the food is being eaten has got vegetables in it because the archaeobotanists are sitting there waving at them. So we have to learn to work together. What we would really like, what would be so helpful, would be the isotopes on human bones. Because with isotopes, a bit like with the work that Professor Chase was doing on the cattle, we can actually start looking at things like C3 versus C4 plant inclusion that humans have been eating, and then also look at their trophic level, which would tell us not how much, but how far up the trophic chain somebody is, and whether there were patterns. So, for example, using a different region, we know that in parts of Chile and Peru during the Archaic period, Neolithic, children were being weaned at a certain age, and you can see that in their isotopes. So we could actually get things like the weaning age of children by looking at isotopes. So that's what we need to sort of move beyond, is like just, we have the plants, we have the animals, we're getting the residues, now we need the isotopes. And when we get that, then I can answer.
Okay. Well, at least there is a clear path that, if you do X,
Yeah.
Y, Z, maybe eventually you will reach there, which is good to know. Final question, and I will share all the questions to you so you can answer them whenever you find time. Does the difference in pottery shapes across sites
Yeah, I also want
indicate
to.
a difference in dietary habits? Is there any relationship that you can see? Any
Also, in
correlation?
terms of storage, I wanted to know, is there a difference in the way they stored millets versus the way they stored barley and wheat, like in terms of pottery?
So from the archaeobotanical point of view, our material doesn't come out of the storage, out of any vessels,
Right, right.
because if you think back to the preservation point, we're always looking at things that got burnt. So when I'm teaching this to children, I usually make the point that future archaeologists will love my mother. I adore my mother, but she's not a very good cook. So she's always burning things and they always go in the bin because nobody wants to eat it because it's got burnt. And it's not things that are being put into storage because it's things that have been badly cooked. Things that go into storage might be things that say, for example, my father has been cooking because he's a chef, and therefore, or he was a chef, and therefore, they're not going to survive because they're either going to get eaten or they're going to rot away if you leave it for too long. So correlating or linking the archaeobotany to vessels for storage is almost impossible. However, with the residues, that's where we can start doing this. But we need a bigger data set because at the moment we haven't got very many analysed. The two things that I showed you, Exeter's graphs and Kalyan's graphs, there's only 3 papers out. So it's 3 papers. And it's because residues are so expensive. They're unbelievably expensive to run at the moment. So I think maybe in another 2 or 3 years, we'll have a big enough data set where we can start doing some correlation between, or some correspondence analysis between vessel form and residue. In Exeter's data set, there was no correlation between vessel and food.
Okay.
But we need more data. Sorry.
Thank you. No, it's really important for us to understand this. Thanks a lot. Sorry, we would like to keep talking about this topic. So over to Gauri to introduce the next speaker. And it was fabulous, Professor Bates.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Professor Bates. That was fantastic and opened our eyes to so many, many things.
Yes.
Thank you so
For
much.
an hour and a half, you've just glued.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful it was. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Over to you, Gauri.
Yeah, our next speaker for the day is Dr. Brad Chase. He's talking about family and kinship in Harappan times. Families are as universal across human societies as they are diverse in their biocultural construction. This was surely the case in the Indus civilization as well. Yet, with a few important exceptions, they have rarely been a focus of research or theorizing on South Asia's first urban civilization. While there is much that is not known and probably cannot be known about the specific organization of Indus families, simply bearing their existence in mind suggests novel interpretations of Indus society and political organization. In this talk, Dr. Brad Chase will primarily highlight the significance of this theoretical perspective with examples from Harappan, Gujarat. Dr. Brad Chase has worked closely with archaeologists from the Maharaja Sahajirao University of Baroda for over 20 years and is currently continuing his research with archaeologists from University of Kerala. His research focuses on studies of anomaly bones and archaeological chemistry from Indus civilization sites in Gujarat. Currently a professor of anthropology in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Albion College, Michigan, USA, Dr. Chase has been a faculty there since 2008. He received his PhD in 2007 from the University of Wisconsin-Madison under the supervision of Dr. Jonathan Mark Kenoyer, whose name has been mentioned by all our earlier speakers as a pioneering researcher of IVC. Over to you, Dr. Chase. You can take the screen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Good evening there. It's morning here.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to what has been an amazing lecture series this week. I've tuned into all of them so far, and I'm really proud to be part of this lineup. So thank you very much. I'm going to get my screen going here.
Yeah.
Make sure I have. Wait a second. Let me. Can't. Oh, there we go. I'm going to share that. And then I'm going to do my presentation. And you should be seeing my screen now?
Yes, yes.
Very good. Excellent. So the title of my talk, as you said, is Family and Kinship in Harappan Times. And it is, well, first of all, and most importantly, and this is why all of we who are students of Marx have learned to put our acknowledgements at the beginning of our talk so that we don't just start talking and forget to acknowledge all the people that have made our work possible. And first of all, the Archaeological Survey of India and the Gujarat Department of Archaeology have made possible the research that I'm presenting on here. I've worked with archaeologists at the University at Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda for 20 years now, more than 20 years actually, especially Drs. Ajit Prasad, Kuldeep Ban, V.S. Sunawani. I could go on and on. Some of the work, the isotope work that I'll talk about, was facilitated by really smart people at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and Albion College Department of Geology and Chemistry, and I'll mention what those folks have done when I get to the point. And then the funding agencies that have supported me over the years. Fulbright, American Institute of Indian Studies, Wenner-Gren Foundation, Archaeological Research and Conservation Program, India and Pakistan, and a lot of work, a lot of support from Albion College in the last 15 years. So the talk that I'm giving today is based on a book chapter called Family, put together by several of the speakers that you've had earlier in the week, Dennis Frenez, Greg Jameson, and it was a Festschrift, felicitation volume from Mark Knoyer, who's my guru, and the person who I learned how to be an archaeologist from when I started at Madison in 2008. And I think I'm just going to jump in and I'll talk about all the debts, intellectual and otherwise, that I've accrued over this time. So we all know where we're at in the world. And we've heard a little bit about the earlier stages. Don't worry, I'm not going to try to talk about 7,000 years of South Asian history, but I like showing these maps to show that the general trend since the adoption of agriculture, both in the hills of Baluchistan with Mehrgarh as the main type site there, the most excavated site, as well as with millets among so-called Mesolithic folks down here in Gujarat. I know several of the speakers talked about the site of, oh golly, anyway. So on with regionalization. This is the development of larger scale urban, or larger scale villages. And the colored dots here represent regional material culture patterns. So the folks in northwestern India and the Punjab are making pottery of a similar style. Ditto here in West Punjab and Sindh and in Gujarat. And Dr. Rajesh yesterday talked about a half dozen different styles of pottery in Gujarat. I was really glad that he gave his talk before I gave my talk. But the main event that most of us are here to hear about is the Indus civilization, also known as the Harappan civilization, after the large major city of Harappa, right up here. And it was at this, it was at Harappa in working with Mark, where I learned how to do archaeology in South Asia. And I learned about the beautiful complexities that have made so many of us think so hard about the past here. And Harappa is a large city. It's over 50 hectares. There's two major mounds, each one of them surrounded by a wall. I mean, just as well as smaller mounds up here and over here. And it just the layout, and probably underneath the modern town of Harappa, and just this layout suggests some of the social complexity of the Indus civilization that has challenged scholars for generations. You know, was it one city? Was it multiple cities? Who was in charge of this city or these cities? It's different than other contemporary cities in the Bronze Age world, where if they're surrounded by a wall, they're surrounded by a singular wall, usually centered on the royal precinct of a king of some sort, that aggrandize their oftentimes bloody and violent rise to power and conquest of enemies. None of that's here. And that's something I've thought about for a long time, ever since I first learned how to excavate Harappan archaeological sites with Dr. Mark Knoyer right here. And there's baby Brad 24 years ago excavating. And I was very lucky to have found to have been present when the people who were working with us in Pakistan found a very important seal, and that was this unfinished elephant seal, similar to this one here. Dr. Jameson yesterday spoke about his research with the seals. And one of the things that his work has shown, he as well as Ayumu have shown us, is that these types of square seals with the animal and an inscription, like they seem to have their origins further north in the area of the northern Indus Valley, and that's really important. Some other types of artifacts, and I'm showing these Indus artifacts from Harappa because they'll be important in a few minutes when I move to Gujarat. In addition to those fantastic seals, something that hasn't gotten a type of artifact that has not gotten a lot of screen time in this lecture series are the terracotta objects. And I think they're just fabulous. These are all found at Harappa individually and have been reassembled into a type of cart. There's a variety of different cart frames showing the diversity of transportation practice. You know, a little human figurine there and wheels. And I'm pausing on this slide a little bit because these are almost never found together. I'm going to foreshadow a little bit and say that they are found in Harappan, Gujarat, which is fascinating. But they're never found together. So some of the objects I'm going to show were probably part of sets like this, but not together. These hardstone beads are very iconically Indus. We've learned from Dr. Prabhakar, as well as Rajesh yesterday. We learned about the drilling methods using the ernestite drills. This is actually a pot from the late Harappan period at Harappa, where some person, possibly a child, I like to think it was a kid, collecting beads in the street, put them all in this vessel, and then archaeologists were lucky enough to find it, and it includes a sample of beads that were made during all different periods. It's really an amazing find that Dr. Knoyer made some years ago. Shell bangles are another very iconic Indus ornament. These are made out of seashells. Turbinella pyrum that's available on the coast. And then this type of pottery, this so-called classical Harappan style pottery. Dr. Ajit Prasad on Monday showed a lot of examples of this. And I just want you to note the red slip and the black designs. It's very distinctive. Here's a shot of mine from back in 2001 of the excavations at Harappa, just showing how much deposition there has been at this urban center. You see this person with in the shadow here wearing the blue camise. And I'm taking this picture from the top of the mound, and here's another view from the bottom of that same excavation area. And you go, as we move from the regionalization era up to the integration era, the period of the classical Harappan civilization or Indus civilization from 2600 to 1900 BC, all these artifacts are found together. And most of them have developmental histories that can be traced throughout almost 1,000 years of development at the site. Your styles of pottery and beads and seals develop through time to become the iconic artifacts that we Indus archaeologists are all intimately familiar with. Here's an artist's reconstruction of based on Knoyer's excavations of what an area of entry into the city, a gateway, may have looked like between two of the mounded areas. And it's a little bit challenging to portray life in the ancient Indus cities because they don't have any of the fantastic tombs and burials and monuments to a vainglorious and bloody past like so many of other places do. But I love this image, and I'm going to show it a couple times throughout my talk. This is, I believe, from a National Geographic article that was profiling the Marx Knoyer's excavations at Harappa about 25 years ago. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is based on his observations, his intuition, his hypotheses, based upon having grown up in South Asia and based upon a career of ethno-archaeology, working with modern craftspeople, that most of those iconic objects were the product of domestic production. There was families that made those things, either for their own use or for trade and exchange, family businesses. And an observation that Mark made, in writing at least, in 1989, in a volume called Old Problems and New Perspectives. It's lovely for us in 2024 to look back at a volume from 1989 that says New Perspectives. And it was that different types of crafts must have been produced by differently organized families. And this was based on Mark's ethno-archaeological research with craftspeople in Bengal, that the folks who were involved, and also with stone bead manufacture in Kambat and Gujarat, that the folks who were involved in crafts that involved both long distance, that required long distance networks to procure the rare raw materials, the marine shell or the hard stone to make the beads, as well as complex technologies, had maintained kinship networks that oftentimes even crossed international borders. So they were operating as family businesses outside of state power in the 20th century. And in the absence of evidence for state power, kingship, and so forth in the Indus cities, it seems likely, and it was very influential thought for me, that it was family businesses that made most of the fantastic stuff that we recognize as Indus or Harappan. Now, for geopolitical reasons, I've spent I was not able to continue doing research as a graduate student in Pakistan after 2001, and have worked with archaeologists at MS University in Baroda, Maharaja Sayajirao University in Baroda in Gujarat since 2001, so almost 25 years now. And Gujarat was the center for the procurement. It was the source of the raw materials from which a lot of those most iconic Harappan artifacts were produced. Yeah, just moving around a thing here. The city of Dolavira, which we've heard a lot about this week, about 50 hectares, concentric planned layout, reservoirs, water management. It's completely different in organizational structure than the city of Harappa, with the multiple walled mounds and and it's also something I want to point out here while I have a layout of the city of Dolavira, is that this center point here, the so-called castle, the earliest part of the city of Dolavira, it's similar in size, in scale, and construction to many of the other settlements that were established around 2500 BC throughout Gujarat along trade and travel corridors. These very small walled settlements. Bagasara is about 1/4 hectare. Shikarpur is about 1 hectare of walled area, so about 2% the size of the total size of Dolavira. Lotal is a little bit larger, around 10 hectares. And this combination of facts that Gujarat was the source of the raw materials from which iconic Harappan material culture was crafted, that it was most obviously apparent. It occurs most commonly at these walled settlements that were established, in relatively short order and that have similarity to the largest city in the region. In the 1980s and into the 90s, inspired a previous generation of archaeologists to interpret them as colonies, as fortifications established by colonizing agents from Sindh, from the Indus Valley, who first established Dolavira, and then a network of outposts. And this interpretation was bolstered when it was recognized that so many of these smaller village sites that had previously been thought to be late Harappan, because they're generally devoid. There's generally an absence of Harappan material culture, all that iconic stuff, and a little bit and a regional variation of ceramics. When it was found that they're not late, but most of them are contemporary with these walled centers, it led to parallels being drawn in the literature between episodes of European colonialism from the 17th and 18th centuries. And this is a very different, first of all, I have a lot of respect for the folks who wrote these things: Greg Pissell, M.K. Dawalekar, J.P. Joshi. These are some people whose names are attached to these ideas in the 1980s and 90s. They pushed it forward. They led us all, including myself, to think about Harappan Gujarat in a different way, not just as farming villages that grew into towns, but rather as part of an historical process. And it was part and parcel of a way of thinking that was really global at that time in the 80s and 90s to think about colonial parallels, to use something called world systems theory to try to understand the movement of materials and raw materials and finished goods across different regions. But, and a lot of people in the audience are probably thinking this, but wait a minute. In European colonialism in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries was highly militarized and very bureaucratic. And that is not characteristic of the Indus civilization. The Indus civilization does not seem to have been militaristically organized, and as important as the writing system and the seals are, it just does not seem to have been heavily bureaucratic in the way that some of its contemporary Bronze Age civilizations were. So that led me to think about this stuff at the earlier part of my career. And then as I started to become very familiar with the archaeological record in Gujarat, there were inconvenient facts that just didn't fit this model at all. And first of these is that there's tremendous variation in the architectural design of these walled enclosures, not just size, but orientation, layouts. Sarkota has got two walled areas, whereas Kanmer, Shikarpur, Bagasar, and Lothal just have one. Lothal has a dock. None of the others do. There's not, once we start to dig into the details, there is not this, it does not seem that there's this colonial imposition. Another inconvenient fact is that inside these walled areas, yeah, there's craft manufacturing, but it's all done in what is otherwise domestic space. They're mostly residential areas. Lothal is a bit of an exception to this. There's something called a warehouse that's been called a warehouse where a lot of things were being stored in the dock. But at these other sites, we're hard pressed to find areas that wouldn't otherwise be recognized as homes. And three, the thing that I'm going to talk about probably the most for the next couple minutes is there's patterns of material culture distribution at these walled sites and at other small sites that just don't fit with a model of colonialism based on earlier European colonialisms, where some sort of state power establishes factories or forts and through coercion or violence extracts raw materials to send back to the homeland. So I think a starting point has to do with kinship and material culture and livestock. And I think that although evidence for family organization in the archaeological record is notoriously ambiguous, I think it's reasonable to hypothesize that Harappan settlements in Gujarat were inhabited by extended families that practice exogenous marriage practices. And part of the reason I think that is because most of these small walled settlements are very small. There are probably only a few extended families resident at any one of them. And for sons and daughters, each generation to continue to propagate their families, they probably would have had to look elsewhere to find folks that they would not have been culturally considered to be related to. That's what exogenous means in this context, is looking elsewhere to find folks to make families with, to form unions between families. That there were kinship networks that connected these small sites. I think that's reasonable. That those connections we might describe as marriages are often accompanied by the circulation of wealth in the form of gifting. This happens all around the world, whether it's livestock presented as bride wealth in pastoral societies throughout Africa, whether it's contemporary patterns of dowry historically in South Asian societies, whether it is the negotiated exchange of who pays for the reception and who buys the rings in Anglo-American, North American society. Marriages are unions between families that often involve the circulation of wealth and that in agro-pastoral communities worldwide, livestock are an important form of wealth. So I think those are pretty reasonable first principles to begin with, to try to find families and to think about alternative models to a state-imposed colonialism in Gujarat. As we zoom in a little bit, I've been really lucky since 2003, I think, is when I started first visiting the MS University's excavations at Goladoro or Bagasara. Both names are in the literature, as well as their later excavations at Shikarpur. And we zoom in a little bit farther, and these are the walls that surround those sites. They're really massive. They're like 7 to 9 meters thick, mud brick walls on stone bases, surrounding a quarter of a hectare, so about 25 meters on a side at Bagasara, and about 50 meters on a side at Shikarpur. So pretty small locations with really massive walls. Here's just the obligatory picture from the excavations, which is as idyllic and wonderful as it seems. Tea break at the excavations. And excavations by my colleagues and mentors and teachers at MS University were really extensive. If I may, I think they're the gold standard of what archaeological excavations in the Indus civilization should be. And I think they were able to cover so much ground over the course of 8 years at Bagasara and 4 years at Shikarpur, I think, because they're relatively small. But despite their small size, and despite being almost 1,000 kilometers from Harappa, we see these same things that we saw at the city of Harappa. These are seals and a ceiling from Bagasara, and they're all unicorns. We heard so much about unicorn seals from Dr. Jameson yesterday. They have some seal fragments from Shikarpur as well, but here I'm just illustrating some sealings, one of a unicorn and one of a composite animal, a multi-headed animal. We heard something about what the symbolism of that might have meant from Dr. Frenes 2 days ago. So the residents who lived at these two small sites were very well connected, right? Goods were definitely moving. Goods do not move themselves. So people were circulating, and surely ideas were circulating between Gujarat and the Indus civilization at this time. That pottery I asked everyone to pay attention to, that red slipped and black painted pottery that's called Harappan pottery, that we see it develop at places like Harappa, is characteristic of the city of Mohenjo-daro, and when archaeologists see this, they celebrate and give out sweets because we have a Harappan site now. That's awesome, but it's actually the minority of the pottery at both of these sites, most of which is this local type ceramic that Dr. Rajesh was telling us about. These are examples of the so-called Anarta type pottery that has a developmental sequence in North Gujarat from the 4th millennium BC. In later phases at the site, it's at both of these sites, it is the Sorat type pottery that's there. There's micaceous redware there. There's all the types that Rajesh was talking about yesterday are there, and they're the majority. These Harappan vessels are distinctive and exciting, but they're relatively rare. And this is based on what I'm about to, some of the material culture patterning I'm about to show is based on an article that I wrote with Ajit Prasad, Rajesh, Ambika Patel, who's now a dean of fine arts at MS University, and Banu Sharma. If you want to read this or any of the other things I'm talking about, the audience can zap the QR code, and there'll be opportunities to do that throughout the rest of the talk. Here are some of the folks that I worked together with to reconstruct some of the patterns from these. There's a lot of stuff at these sites, like a lot of stuff. That's a lot of bags to open and a lot of measuring to be done and a lot of counting to do. And one of the first things that we noticed, and frankly, I mean, to be totally honest, Ajit Prasad and Sanawani and Kuldeep Bhan, they had all recognized this stuff in the field and were telling me about it. But as a graduate student, I really needed to spend a couple months counting things to see if my teachers were right. And they were absolutely 100% and totally right that objects, there's just differences in the frequency of objects at the two different sites. And first, I'll talk about some of the things that are the most common at Bagasara, and then I'll talk about some of the things that are the most common at Shikarpur. And the thing to point out here is that all the typically Harappan material culture objects are present at both sites, but in very different frequencies. Some of them. Others are present in similar frequencies at both sites. And I'm showing another chart because it has numbers at the bottom. And I just want to point out how much stuff was at these tiny little sites. Shell bangle fragments at Bagasara, there are over 1,000 shell bangle fragments. Almost as many at Shikarpur. So these little steatite beads, there were over 7,000 at Bagasara and over 4,000 at Shikarpur. And these are all indexed against the total number of ornament-related objects, so that even though the numbers are different, the percentage is roughly similar. A lot of faience beads at Bagasara because, as we saw in Dr. Ajit Prasad's talk, and also in Prabhakar's talk, I believe Bagasara was a center of manufacture for faience. That's amazing. And then a lot more terracotta bangles at Shikarpur. Hard stone beads, those iconic stone beads like from the pot at Harappa, they're not that common, but all the major types are there. There's the long carnelian beads. Here's an Amazonite bead, lots of different types of agate beads, a short carnelian bead, and even lapis beads from Afghanistan. But almost all the rest of these raw materials are available in Gujarat. That's neat. There's a lot of variation in these beads. Some are big, some are small. They're different colors, they're different shapes. They were mostly drilled with those earnestite drill bits. But the things that I think are super interesting are here the faience beads that were being crafted at Bagasara. And look, and here's some shell bangles I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and steatite beads. Bagasara was a center of manufacture for shell bangles. Here, Ajit Prasad showed a lot more pictures of Bagasara, and here's the stockpile of shells. Kuldeep Bhan's work has shown that most of these shells were too small to be made into bangles and had wormholes, so that these were like the leftover after the shipment came in. These are actually unfinished down here. They're not polished, so they look like this one actually. That's rough. Has square edges and is not polished. So that was a pile of, that was a stash of bangles that were awaiting the finishing stages. But manufacture of shell bangles was happening in both sites, and we know that by counting how many unfinished bangles there were. And these numbers here actually exclude the bangles from that workshop. These are just things that were found throughout the rest of the site. And there's a lot. It was a really important industry at both of these sites, even though we found the workshop at Bagasara. And those bangles were bangles of that style that were produced at Bagasara, Shikarpur, and at other sites in Gujarat were found throughout the major cities of the Indus civilization, and they were one of the only artifacts to be buried with the dead. Not the only one. Steatite beads find their way into some graves, as do hardstone beads, but bangles are pretty important, and they're mostly found in women's graves. Not exclusively, but mostly. And we went and studied them a little bit further and looked at their widths. Several people asked about the diameters in the comments of the last couple days. They said, is it possible to figure out if it was men or women wearing them, or adults or children? And those are questions we had. And the problem we found, Rajesh and Ambika and Ajit Prasad and Banu and I, when we were working on this, is that the shell bangles from Gujarat that were made at the Bagasar and Shikarpur are oval shape, because they slice the shell at an angle. And so it's really hard to get a clear diameter based upon small fragments. But the widths were easy enough, where the widths were able to define a standard way to take the measurement in cross section, as shown here. And we found that there is a significant difference. At Shikarpur, there's a greater representation of thinner bangles. And at Bagasara, there's more wider bangles. Based upon ethno-archaeological observation, Knoyer has suggested that thinner bangles, more delicate bangles, might be associated with wealthier communities. And that's an idea that I'll come back to in a little bit. But here's just a representative example of one of the thin kinds of bangles and one of the thicker kinds of bangles. And interestingly, as has been mentioned, but maybe not emphasized by some of the previous speakers, the only decoration on Indus shell bangles, Harappan shell bangles, is a V-shaped chevron that's carved in. This was certainly symbolically important, whether it was a thin little chevron or a chevron on a thinner bangle or on a thicker bangle. Whenever we find decoration, that's what they are. And they're usually at the part where the shell is at like the seam of the shells. Another artifact that I thought was super interesting are these steatite beads. They're actually the most common object-oriented ornament-related object at both sites, because a single necklace or bracelet of these beads are made of these whitened steatite beads would have included hundreds of beads. And what we're and although they're distributed throughout the site, it doesn't mean that there were 7,000 necklaces, but rather 7,000 beads. And these beads are maybe one of the most distinctive Indus ornaments. They were probably produced in the millions, and they both require materials obtained from a great distance, as well as a very sophisticated technology to produce. And this is what I'm about to say is based on work that Randall Law has been working on for almost 20 years now. I'm happy and proud to have played some small part in the bead work most recently, but this is really his work, and he working with the folks at the nuclear reactor lab at the University of Wisconsin have figured out a way, using instrumental neutron activation analysis and changing those protocols to do the analysis on individual beads, as well as when compared with his collection of raw steatite materials from throughout the areas surrounding the Indus Valley, has shown that basically all of the beads, with the exception of one single bead from the site of Kota Dabadali, were all made from steatite that was located way up here. So while the folks at Bagasar and Shikarpur were producing shell bangles that were found at the cities of Sindh and the Punjab and buried with the dead there, and very ideologically important, they seem to have been consumers of whitened steatite beads. And because they're relatively uniform, they're produced from raw materials from a long distance away, actually outside the distribution of Indus settlements, and circulated widely. They're found at pretty much every Indus site, or wherever those other artifacts are found. White steatite beads are also found. I think they have a lot of currency-like properties. The folks in Gujarat were largely consumers of these things, producers of shell bangles, consumers of white steatite beads, and that's great. Shows interregional connectivity, movement of people, goods, and ideas. But all these other dots of small rural villages that were contemporary with these walled settlements, there's no white steatite beads at those sites. Very rarely. At that site, there's a site, I don't have it on this map, called Kota de Budali. It's a very interesting, very small, important, but very small and very rural site with regional ceramics. There's a handful of bangles, about 200 beads, and it seems like it could be a set of jewelry that might have even belonged to one person. We haven't done the contextual analysis there. That site was excavated by Prabodh Shilarkar from Deccan College, and we haven't done the contextual analysis to figure out, and it may not ever even be possible to figure out if it was all just from one person's ornaments. But that's an exception that proves the rule. There's a small site, what's been interpreted as a pastoral encampment, where there was a pot that contained 1,000 white steatite beads, probably one necklace. Navinal, which unfortunately is underneath my iconic image of British colonialism, in British East India Company. It's a mostly rural site with local ceramics, and they have found a relatively small amount of shell bangles and white steatite beads. So it's not that stuff's completely absent, but it's really rare. I can pretty much count the number of these small rural sites that have the shiny, fancy stuff. The shiny, fancy stuff that has currency-like properties. That's completely different than historical colonialisms that were financially based upon colonizers selling finished goods to local rural populations in exchange in exchange for subsistence goods. And maybe if following a model of colonialism and based upon on European colonialism, 17th, 18th, 19th century, and so-called world systems theory, we would expect to find finished Harappan goods all over the place. Right, that was the colonists traded for the food that they needed to eat, and that's not what we're finding here at all. And so we have to resign ourselves to the fact that maybe the Harappans in Gujarat were really bad at colonialism. Or there's another way of thinking about it. And I think that another way of thinking about it has to do with families. And so I'm going to turn here to Shikarpur to show you why I think this. And that's that these types of objects are the most common at Shikarpur. And they're not the shiny, fancy Harappan stuff. They're terracotta. They're the wheels for cart frames and the little bowls for pulling them. And there's balls and bangles and beads and all this stuff made out of terracotta. And you can mold terracotta, you can mold clay into so many different forms. But the fact that these folks were making them in the same forms as people elsewhere throughout the Indus civilization, even down to the location of perforations on their necks for attaching yokes for these little play sets, or narrative scenes that might have been set up, or narrative scenes that became play sets. It's amazing. And I guess on the topic of kinship, something to be mentioned that all around the world, things that start off as sacred objects become kids' toys. Here in the United States, the nativity scenes that we use to represent the birth of Christ, like every kid has played with those along with their GI Joes and Star Wars. So whether these things were sacred objects or kids' toys, it's not clear. but they were being made in a very similar way at these two sites. And this is the head of a socketed figurine, where the head of the bull would have moved around, which is kind of neat to think about. And similar forms are found throughout. But at Bugasara, after 10 seasons of excavation, they only identified 25 pieces of shell of terracotta bangle. Whereas after 4 seasons at Shikarpur, my colleagues at MS University tabulated 900 pieces. People were doing more stuff with terracotta in an Indus way at Shikarpur, and that's very obvious with the terracotta cakes, which were probably used as artificial stones at places like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, where there is no naturally occurring local stone raw materials for construction. These terracotta cakes were used as furniture, as fill, to fill in mud puddles, in house foundations. They were used in kilns to prop up pottery while it was being fired, and they were probably used domestically in kitchens to keep food warm. Heat them up, put them in a pot. And at Bugasara, after 10 seasons, they only found 300 of them. And at Shikarpur, after 4 seasons, they found over 77,000. And it was Dr. Rajesh who counted all of these. Because at excavations at Shikarpur, they were just piled up and tabulated along with the pottery. And that was one of his responsibilities. And along with the terracotta objects, also Harappan cooking pots are much more frequent at Shikarpur than they are at Bugasara. At Bugasara, Dr. Kitty Lindstrom in her 2013 dissertation, she spent a year or two going through ceramics at Bugasara looking for Harappan cooking pots and only found 19. Most of the rest of the pottery at the site is local styles, including local styles of cooking pot that was bowls, like Dr. Ajit Prasad talked about on Monday, that was probably used to cook millet type foods, porridges and so forth. And whereas Harappan cooking pots are very distinctive, like handi type cooking pot, you can pick up like so, and they're much more common at Shikarpur. So in summary, both the residents of both Shikarpur and Bugasara made and used Harappan style material culture. There's significant variation in the abundance between the two sites. And the artifacts related to Harappan domestic practice are much more common at Shikarpur. People were doing things differently at these two sites. They were outwardly, through their jewelry and ornamentation, manifesting, communicating their identity as Harappans, if you will, the same as folks at Mohenjo-daro or Shikarpur. But at home, they seem to have been doing things differently. They seem to have been cooking food differently. They seem to have been reproducing culture differently. And this pattern is not consistent with a model of state organized colonialism, where we would expect all of the implanted so-called or interpreted settlements to have been ethnically and culturally similar. What we see is a great degree of diversity underneath a veneer of uniform Harappan material culture. And I think that this is consistent with models of exogenous marriage in a dynamic borderland context. That if every generation, and these sites were occupied for several hundred years, if every generation folks are sons and daughters are looking for unions with folks, sons and daughters from other sites, some places like Bugasara are going to form more unions and connections with families from the rural hinterland, where culture and cooking and life was reproduced in the home in a manner the way that it had been for generations past and the way that it was throughout the countryside. Whereas other places, maybe at Shikarpur, they're finding relationships interconnections with families, marriages with families at other walled Harappan sites where people are doing things in their home, reproducing culture in a manner that was similar to other sites in the alluvium up at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and at Dholavira. So you can read in the paper, Family Matters in Harappan Gujarat, more justification for this, but I think that the flexibility of a kinship-based model or understanding of Harappan Gujarat can explain the variation in the distribution of material culture much better than a model of imposed colonialism extracting resources to be sent back to the homeland. The thing is, over generations, asymmetries in marriage patterns could produce the same net movement of finished goods from the hinterland to the cities, the movement of people, wealth, and ideas that other forms of interregional interaction take. So we don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater out, or out with the bathwater. It's still true that a lot of iconic Harappan objects were made from materials in Gujarat, and that they moved from Gujarat up to the cities. But I think there's other ways of thinking about that are much more parsimonious. Everybody has a family. Every culture that anthropologists have ever known have families. Families are reproduced through relationships with other families, that is marriages, and objects and wealth transfer or circulate in that context, and that differently situated settlements and families do things differently. So I don't think that's the case. I think we need to think about families operating in Harappan Gujarat in the same way as Mark Knoyers thought that they organized craft production in the cities. And the last thing is that part of those first principles that led me to think along these ways is that livestock are an important form of wealth, in addition to food and milk and labor. And this is from an article that dropped in 2020, and it's based on the study of animal bones. We saw a picture almost exactly like this in Dr. Bates's talk an hour ago. And faunal analysis is the study of animal bones. And again, I'm not going to talk about this too much in the interest of time, but I was intrigued by the difference in variation in the representation of different domestic species at Bagasara and Shikarpur. And the most obvious is that there's a whole lot more cattle bones at Shikarpur as compared to Bagasara. Sheep and goat, cattle and buffalo, they're both apparent at each. They're both super common, but Shikarpur has more. And to the extent that, and at both sites, and this is just showing Bagasara, cattle bones are the different parts of the skeleton, the skull to the feet, to the ribs, to the arms and legs, fore and hind limbs rather, are distributed very evenly throughout the sites, whereas the sheep and goats show more difference inside and outside the walls, such that the distribution of sheep and goat bones is more in line with with at least some commercial processing of sheep and goats, with butchers operating outside the walls, selling meat to consumers inside the walls. But that's not apparent at all with the bones of cattle that are distributed very uniformly throughout the site, suggesting domestic slaughter and consumption like feasts. And they're huge. Cattle are big. And that suggests to me that they were an important object of feasting. Again, something that's associated with families and events and marriages and culture and wealth. Cattle are cross-culturally important vehicles for the transmission and storage of wealth. And if Bagasara actually was wealthier, that would jibe with the what we've learned about the bangle widths possibly being representative of greater wealth at Shikarpur, and that might be reflected in the cattle as well. It also might be reflective of their having being more plugged into Harappa, interregional networks, being a very attractive target for marriages, and the cattle that might have moved along with those. But my favorite bone on the skeleton are the teeth. This is a jawbone of a goat with and I can tell based upon the way the teeth have worn. Sheep, goats, and cattle, they're hypsodont ruminants, which means that they're ruminants with hypsodont teeth, which means that their teeth keep growing and they're always chewing their cud and they're grinding their teeth down. And so then you can tell by how the pattern of wear on their teeth, how old they were when they stopped moving their mouth, when they were no longer alive, when they were eaten. And this is a 2 to 3 year old goat mandible from Bagasara. This is something that I've worked on using techniques that are used all over the world. I see that most of the cattle at both sites live to well into adulthood. Those cattle and buffalo at both sites were being kept for their secondary products, for milk, for labor, and likely as wealth before they were ultimately consumed, probably in the context of feasting. Whereas sheep and goat, where there's already, I already mentioned evidence of more commercial processing with butchers and consumer outside the walls and consumers inside the walls. They were being raised following a roughly most of them were being eaten somewhere between 1 and 3 years in their second year of life. And that's consistent with the meat production strategy. And they're just much smaller. You can order one at a restaurant even today. This is a goat's tooth all cleaned up and made shiny, with samples of tooth enamel taken off with a dental drill, and then analyzed to study isotopes in the teeth. This is work that I and colleagues did at MS University in Baroda. This is a master's student in 2013, or in 2017. 2016. He's sitting at the cleaning station. This is a student of mine from Albion who came in 2014 to help, sitting in a microscope, using a dentist's drill. This is the type of drill that a dentist uses in the back room to make dentures and so forth, appliances for the mouth. Drilling, collecting the white powder, putting it into vials, doing chemistry with it, putting it into an expensive machine that goes bing, and getting a lot of numbers. And carbon isotopes from tooth enamel can tell us about diet. And in this case of carbon isotopes, higher proportion of the isotope carbon-13 in relation to carbon-12 is characteristic of consumption of a diet comprised of C4 plants. There's two different photosynthetic pathways, C3 and C4. And what's important is that in Harappan Gujarat, C4, about the only C4 plants are domestic millets and wild millets, but millets. And so these cattle were being fed almost exclusively millet products. So grazing on fields, grazing on stubble, grazing on hay, being foddered in the dry season. And these squiggles actually connect values from the 3 samples in the teeth that we took, indicating that they show very little, in most cases, show very little variation in diet throughout the year. They were being foddered with domestic millet products throughout the year. Whereas sheep and goat were being grazed on a diversity of plants, all throughout the environment, mostly C3 plants, that's wild shrubbery, in Gujarat mostly. And there's a great degree of diversity. So their diet was changing throughout the year. The bars are the interquartile range of the values. And that's similar at Bagasara, Shikarpur, and then at a site that I haven't talked about yet called Jaidak, which was occupied after the climate changes of the 4.2 Ka climatic event. So this was part of the main point of the article that this figure derives from, is to show that that agropastoral practice did not change very much through a period of climate change. It was resilient. It was sustainable. What changed was society, not agriculture. There's no big crash of the agricultural system with the global climate changes manifested in South Asia at 2100 BC. When I compare the values between the earliest samples from individual teeth and the latest samples, it seems that the animals were not moving around while their teeth were forming. They were being raised in place. But where? And to figure out, and this is based on strontium isotopes. Strontium, a ratio of strontium-87 to strontium-86, that ratio varies across the geological landscape. That ratio of strontium isotopes goes from the bedrock into the soil, into the plants, into the animals, ultimately into the people. We were observing it at the point of tooth formation in the livestock, what you are, what you eat, and find that most livestock, cattle as well as sheep and goats, are being raised in a very tightly restricted geographic range. They're tethered to their village, but where that requires monitoring of strontium isotope ratios across the landscape. And this is a paper that dropped a couple of years ago called What is Left Behind? Advancing Interpretation of Pastoral Land Use in Harappan, Gujarat using Herbivore Dung to examine biosphere strontium isotope variation. And this is a student from Albion named Bob. And in 2013, he came with me, and we collected, it was 2015. We collected poop from cattle, sheep, goats, and nilgai if we could. And Bob's sitting here with a pile of the much anticipated nilgai poop. And we got it from different, so we got poop from different species because the animals eat the plants, mix it all up in their stomach, and then plop it out into nice little samples that sample a couple square kilometer area. And we did that in different geological areas. This is our sampling locations imposed over the archaeological sites in the state, and a geological map of Gujarat. And the strontium isotope values match the geology quite nicely. And what we find here is that the villages from where the animals were raised, all the animals consumed at Bagasara were not being raised at Bagasara. They were being raised in villages, sometimes a considerable distance away, in different colored zones as represented on this map. So most are from the green area, from villages in the green area prior to being sent to Bagasara to be eaten, but plenty are coming from the orange area, which is where Shikarpur is, but plenty at Shikarpur are also coming from the green area. The patterns at Jaidak after the climate change at 2100 BC are really quite similar. There's a little bit of difference, but it's not statistically very significant. And it tells us that during the integration area, the grazing ranges for animals from Bagasara and Shikarpur demonstrate considerable overlap with a trend towards local values. and this is the same during the localization era at Jaidak. Here's another way of representing the grazing, the potential livestock source areas at Bagasara and at Shikarpur, a great degree of overlap. Or I'm sorry, at Bagasara and Shikarpur and Jaidak. Lots of overlap before and after the climate changes of at 2100 BC. So the evidence from Gujarat is consistent with the idea that livestock economies were structured by practices related to the creation and maintenance of kinship networks or marriages. It's consistent with. There's probably other ways to explain the patterning, but I think that's the most parsimonious, is that animals were raised in a village and found their way into the sites along with the movement of people. The pastoral economy was resilient and sustainable through a period of climate change, and it implies that there was a continuity of social practice by which it was structured. So that in Gujarat, it seems likely that the momentous social changes at the end of the integration era reflect a reorganization of kinship networks from commercial to rural economies. Who's more attractive to form a union with? Families at the now defunct manufacturing centers, or at healthy, thriving rural villages, small towns like Jaidak. I think what we're seeing is a social change in Gujarat, at least, not a climatically driven change in subsistence practices that allows for the continuity of these marriage practices and kinship structures that I believe are a better explanation for the archaeological record in Gujarat, and that families matter in Harappan Gujarat. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chase. If you could close the presentation, we can have the. You can stop sharing.
Right. That's what I'm trying to do. Stop share.
Right. Yes. You wanted to leave at 8:30 p.m. India time, so we have about 14 minutes.
Yeah,
is that
absolutely.
okay? So we will have a few questions. I have, if we, though it doesn't make sense. Let's say if we can compare the modern society with the Harappan society going back 4,500 years, you'll see that the urban areas where there is a lot more of productivity, more wealth, there is more of sort of nuclear families rather than extended families, because you have multiple choices, right? You could be a bead maker, you could be a seal maker. You have more choices, right? But agrarian societies are predominantly, you need more bodies to work in the field. It's fairly tough work. We're talking about pre-industrial agriculture. So whatever specialized tools they would have made, it would have still been quite difficult. So a Dolavira would have a very different family structure vis-a-vis any of the smaller places that you were talking about, right?
I think so.
Begusarai and Shikarpur themselves, we don't know the size of the settlements there, which would also impact, what kind of families live there. Kinship. I would like to ask you about the exogamous marriage as well. But what is your immediate view on this? I mean, will it be uniformly an extended family, or will it change, or would it have changed?
Families. I think the only thing that is uniform about families around the world is how variable they are. You know,
Okay.
and so that's why I have in the if you were to read the paper upon which this talk was based, I don't make any attempt to say whether they were matrilineal families or patrilineal families, which direction wealth was flowing, was it a bride wealth or a dowry, but just to recognize that such practices are actually common, without going into the details, because what is common is variation and variability. And so, yeah, absolutely, I 100% agree with the observation that there are more choices for the kids, professions to follow in an urban setting like
Right.
Dolavira. But it could also be families from Dolavira that send, that a son or a daughter or a son and their in-laws went off to establish a business at places like Shikarpur or Bagasara, that maintain those connections to the city.
Okay.
And that the folks, but then that other families in those small centers were maintaining connections in the countryside.
Correct.
And maybe the same family. You could imagine a situation with the same family at Bagasara, or one son or daughter is married to somebody from Shikarpur, and they have an in-law at Dolavira, and another son or daughter from a family at Bagasara has family in central Saurashtra.
Right.
And in that way, it's every site has is enmeshed in a dense network of kinship and also material production and circulation. And I think it might be impossible to ever know the finer details, at least without a whole lot of skeletons and DNA analysis, which I just don't think exist right now.
Right.
But I think that thinking about it in this way explains the situation better than a previous generation of models that saw Harappans colonizing the place and oppressing the locals.
Yes. There is a question from Alan George. Though you had suggested that Gujarat Harappans were less bureaucratic and militant than contemporary Bronze Age cultures, what could then explain the humongous fortifications of Dolavira?
Good. I mean, that's a really good question that makes me think a lot. An answer that's been suggested for other sites like Harappa is that they were about, one, flood control, two, in controlling access into the city. So a place like Harappa, there's evidence that there's seals and ceilings nearby the gateway areas that could have been used as a means of collecting some sort of tax on merchants and merchants, craftspeople, normal people coming into and out of the cities. And the folks at the small sites, Bagasara, Shikarpur, Kanmer, they were producing things that were very valuable. I could imagine that what I think of as families who are producing the things might want to maintain control and possibly even secrecy over the process. So do it behind the walls. Dolavira flood control definitely is important. And the reason, if these explanations for the large walls at Indus sites seem a little bit like we're stretching, like we're having to think around the problem, it's because there's a lack of evidence for militarism in the Indus civilization. There was a very influential book some years ago called A Peaceful Realm by Jane McIntosh. And I'm sure there were conflicts. I'm not sure that the Peaceful Realm headline necessarily captures the complexity of Indus civilization, but it's certainly there's not as violence and state organized violence is not manifest in the material culture. It's not depicted graphically. There's not mass graves. It'd be a whole lot easier for us archaeologists to explain the walls if there was also a whole lot of evidence for militarism, which there isn't. And that's why we're left then to think about flood control, economic access, secrecy, culture, all those things.
Okay. There are a few questions from one very persistent participant. Agni is his name. So there are, in fact, tens of questions from him. I'll just take a selection of them. So one question from him is, from the size of the cooking vessels, can you estimate the size of the families?
I don't think so. Now, I have big pots, small pots. I use them on different occasions. My family's small. When I've, in any part of the world, but in South Asia for sure, families have different size, have many different cooking vessels. I tend to think not. I tend to think a larger family might just have more cooking vessels of a variety of sizes. But that's my initial take. And the reason I think that no one has gone there archaeologically in the context of Indus archaeology is that something called site formation processes. Bagasar and Shikarpur each have about 6 meters of deposition, which are a house with a foundation, a brick foundation, and a floor gets filled in, and then eventually it has to be rebuilt. So everything gets knocked over and piled in. The pottery that we have is mostly broken up small pieces of pottery from fill, that foundation fill of older houses. And so to associate different sized pottery with individual households is thus far impossible at the sites that I'm familiar with. So if in theory we could have a nice selection of ceramics that we could measure the width of the pots, and it was all and we knew which houses it came from, and the floor, the area of the floor plan of the houses, in theory we might find a pattern there. But the data is not very suggestive. The data is not very amenable to that. And I think that households have many different size pots.
Right. We had a similar question over the last 3 days. From looking at the floor plan, can we estimate how many people were living there? And the answer was not so, because same size, you could have 3 or 4 people living there. You could have 20 people living there, right? It's very difficult to, conjecture so much, draw things to such an extent. Another question from him.
If I may, with the excavation, with the nature of settlement inside walls, with layer upon layer upon layer upon layer over hundreds of years, in reality, when looking at the architecture, or looking at the excavation drawings, it's often hard to tell where one house ends and another begins. Some walls are fragmentary, some walls are not. Anyway.
Right. Another question from him is, how is the lifespan estimated from the remains? You were talking about goat, 2 to 3 years by just looking at the tooth patterns, right?
So if so animals like sheep, goat, and cattle, they in American English we say chew their cud. They have four stomachs, and they're constantly, it's gross. They're gross to think about, but they're chewing constantly.
Ruminating.
Yeah, ruminating. And their teeth wear down, and it exposes the dentin. And dentin is what's in between the enamel.
Okay.
And it gets exposed in a certain way. And the best way for me to, I'm going to share again real quick.
Sure.
going to come back to this lovely picture of my goat's teeth here. There you go.
We can't see the image.
You have to share the screen.
Yeah, I forgot to hit the share button. I chose. There we go.
Yes.
Yep. So these teeth in the back, this third molar that's just erupting, it's all enamel. And then in this most forward part of the tooth that is probably just sticking up above the gum, the enamel is just starting to wear away to expose the dentin. Here in this second molar, there's two islands of dentin surrounded by enamel. And then here they're connected. In this first molar, it's all continuous. And so it just comes from a very, this has been worked out, the pattern of enamel wear and dentin exposure has been worked out for sheep, goats, and cattle around the world over the course of the last 50 years. And so it just comes from a very detailed observation and then making charts and graphs out of how many teeth of different types we have. It gets kind of complicated, but it's ultimately based on recognizing patterns of enamel wear.
Right. There's a question from M.B. Bhaskar. Does strontium analysis limits animal range and mobility? Does this mean that long distance trade was broken down to a series of short distance trade points?
It seems to be the case, or at least we have not identified animals involved in long distance trade. Not to say that they do not exist, but when I say we, I mean my work in Gujarat, and then work by Dr. Cameron Petrie. He'll be speaking tomorrow, and his team from Cambridge and Banaras Hindu University to promote tomorrow's talk. They have applied these same techniques of strontium isotope analysis up there and have found a very similar pattern. Animals are not, the animals that were consumed as food and that we've studied their bones did not seem to move around very much, but they do seem to have moved from a little, once they were had achieved adulthood and their teeth had formed, then they seem to have been consumed in a slightly different place. But he and his team have a paper that just came out this year in January, I believe, that asked that very similar question. We see evidence for interregional long distance trade, but we haven't found the animals involved in that trade. So could it have been a serial down the line type of trade? So yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Chase. I think it's time for you. You have hard stop. So thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Gauri, over to you to wrap up today's proceedings.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Chase. That was really a wonderful talk. That brings us to the end of day 4. Tomorrow we have 2 more talks lined up for you. First is by Dr. Mayank Vahia on understanding the Indus script in the context of its culture. And then the second talk is by Dr. Cameron Petrie on fragile yet resilient environmental change and the Indus civilization. We hope to see all of you tomorrow. For all those who missed any of the talks over the past 4 days, they are available at our YouTube link. Thank you so much. Good night. See you tomorrow at 5:30. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again tomorrow.